Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if gods are creating their army. And Naruto Awakens. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Once upon a time there was a lonely boy. This boy was very sad and of course lonely. He had never had a family or anyone to care about him. He grew up hated and ignored. He wished for attention even from those that were cruel to him. He made a mask, one that was always happy no matter what. One that would never let anyone get to him. He pulled pranks for attention. Even if it was mean and angry attention, it was better than none. The mask was used so often that the boy himself became the mask. However, one person broke that mask. Another lonely boy, one who had his family is taken from him. Because of this the boy thought they could be friends. This did not happen. The other hated everything and everyone, especially the masked boy. Because of this no matter what he did, the other boy always brought him down. While with anyone else, he would bounce back or ignore them. He couldn't ignore the one like him. Time passed on and he found others like him. Lonely, misguided, angry, faded. He helped these people with the inner light he possessed. All but the boy that hated him. That boy became the traitor. Turning his back on everything and everyone, he allowed his hatred and darkness to take control, becoming absorbed with it. He left, hurting the masked boy physically and mentally. The boy was sad, but swore to save the one that had called him his friend. His very first and best friend. And even though he said it while trying to kill him, no one had ever said something like that before to him. He promised the flower girl that he would bring him back. Masked boy loved flower girl, but flower girl loved the traitor. Masked boy knew this would never change, but he would rather flower girl be happy. Even if it was without him. Masked boy left his village. To become stronger. Against the people that hunted him, for the flower girl, and to save the traitor. One of the first days out he met the blind girl. The blind girl's mind had been warped and twisted into believing the Ancient One. She did his biddings without complaint. Killing all as she was ordered, judging them as he saw fit. Going against her very nature because she had become blinded by the affection, trust, faith, and lies he told her. The Ancient One had saved her. Making her feel useful and worthwhile. She swore her life to the Ancient One. She was blind to his true malice. She gave the boy advice and left, leaving behind a mess of destruction. The masked boy and his teacher lay the judge to rest. The teacher stopping the boy from mistakenly taking the dead's payment toll. 2.5 years passed. The masked boy grew up, starting to harness the great power of the 9 tails. He returned to his home. Greeting the flower when he arrived. 3 blurs appeared in the forest, all surrounding the shadowed beast that was crouched before a tree sniffing the ground. One was a girl with pink hair, wearing a red dress and green spandex shorts. The second was a boy with black, blue hair wearing a blue shirt and white shorts. The third was a blonde boy wearing a dark blue and orange jumpsuit. An orange headband holding his bangs up. From each of their positions they could watch the shadowed creature. Each had a collar-like wire wrapped around their necks that hooked to an earpiece. All 3 ducked around what they used as cover and looked to the beast. A distance away 2 people crouched in a tree. A male with gray, silver hair and a Junin uniform, crouched on the left side of the tree. While on the right was a girl with silver and black hair. She wore black baggy pants and a blue kimono top lined with light blue. A blue sash held it closed. She wore a crimson bodysuit underneath. The man sighed, his voice coming over the earpieces a moment later. Gray-haired bastard to his cute students. Come in, cute students. Over. He called, a frown heard in his voice. Sakura glanced over the tree she was hiding behind. She had to hide the chuckle that almost escaped her throat. That was until she remembered her codename. She grits her teeth, clenching her fist. Kagami didn't do much on their missions. She mainly just watched. Because she was an uninfluenced member of the team, she made their codenames. Uninfluenced my ass. Sakura thought in annoyance. Pathetic fangirl. The target is in sight, 3.2 feet away. Over. She whispered, heaving a sigh. Kagami had proven that she hated Sakura deeply. And she still hadn't found out why yet. She wasn't alone in this hatred. It seemed the only one Kagami liked was Naruto. Sasuke looked down from the tree branches he was hiding in. He crouched, leaning forward slightly to spring at the target. Foolish traitor. Target in sight, 3 feet away. Over. He stated calmly. He twitched as he said his name. Every time he said foolish it reminded him of his brother. Kagami would call him nothing but traitor, betrayer, or emo. She was an asset to the team with the fact that she was strong. However, her hatred of him proved that she wouldn't help or teach him anything. He had demanded her to help him once, that hadn't ended so well. Naruto slid from his tree, and slinked around it smoothly. This was something familiar, something he had hoped to never do again. He supposed that this was the only casualty he hadn't regretted in the war. He sighed, smiling fondly as he spoke. Cute little brother. Target in sight, 4 feet away. Over. He called. Should we move in, gray-haired bastard? Protective big sister? He questioned. Kakashi wasn't sure how to react. Ever since he had gotten this team he had been paranoid and abused. Kagami had a deep-rooted hatred for him, as she did with the rest of the team. Only Naruto escaped her wrath, and she was so protective and possessive of him it was dangerous to say a word against him. He should be grateful that Sakura wasn't as abusive toward the boy as he had feared. And he wasn't sure if he should laugh or cry about the situation or not. The basic Team 7 love triangle, only it wasn't basic. And it didn't really fit its legacy. Sakura didn't have as much of a temper as he had thought she would, and she wasn't abusive toward nor did she hate Naruto. She was still a fangirl, and still in love with Sasuke. That seemed to be the only thing correct with his original theory of his team. She was the best with chakra control and genjutsu. Taijutsu wasn't her strong point and she was okay with kunai and shrunken. She could perform low-level ninjutsu, but was limited because of her lack of stamina and chakra reserves. Naruto liked Sakura, but it was in a friendship way instead of an obsessive crush as had been for the previous Team 7s. He still pulled pranks, but was polite, and although he could be cheerful it wasn't the loud obnoxious type he had feared. The boy was the ninjutsu specialist of the team and shockingly the seals expert. Genjutsu was his weakest point, but he wasn't useless against it, and he actually had chakra control down. Not as perfect as Sakura's but shockingly better than Sasuke's. He had a feeling Kagami had helped in this. Sasuke seemed to be the only one in the correct role. He was an obsessed rival with Naruto. And even then he had changed that with liking Kagami in a way. Kakashi knew that was only because he considered her the only one good enough for clan revival right now. Not to mention the only one that won't hold him back. He was their taijutsu user on the team. He had large chakra reserves, not as insanely big as Naruto's, but his control was barely stable at best. He had an affinity to fire already and showed it with the Uchiha clan fire jutsus. Genjutsu was acceptable with him, not the best like Sakura and not as bad as Naruto. He seemed to stick with fire jutsus instead of broadening himself. And Kagami, she hated everyone but Naruto. He should have known that this team would break the years of tradition when it came to Team 7. Her part on the team wasn't really clear. She never really showed her true potential. Whenever she did have to do something she made a show of how much she was holding back. It was obvious he had no clue on her power level. All he knew was that healing was one of her worst abilities. She couldn't use sealing techniques to save her life, and Genjutsu was right under sealing and above healing. Ninjutsu she had a limited arsenal, but he found that wasn't a bad thing. With the ninjutsu she did know she knew to such a level of mastery that no one could beat her with her techniques. Weaponry was her strongest ability under taijutsu. And even then he couldn't get a read on her levels, and until her probation was up her records were sealed by the Hokage. It was a huge difference, but the team was basically the same. Only instead of a hyperactive loud idiot, there was a calm cheerful kid. Instead of a loud banshee, there was a fangirl that was calm and rather confident. Instead of the brooding emo, there was an avenger who actually thought of his future clan. And add an evil little girl. Yay, he had a feeling Team 7 would never reach the cycle it had been. A part of him was happy, maybe this time the team wouldn't suffer tragedy. A part of him mourned the chance to see his past replayed again. He settled for shaking his head, and I smiling. Okay, target confirmed. Move in and apprehend my cute students. He said cheerfully. 3 separate heads nodded. A mere second later, 2 blurs dashed toward the area. A dark blue duck-like one, from above, and a pink and red one going on the ground. They both landed near the target at the same time. Said target's eyes had widened and it jerked its head toward the scary-looking enemies. The target was then grabbed by the pink-haired girl, who was smart enough to hold it tightly to where it had trouble breathing. It tried to squirm out, scratching and clawing. The girl merely growled and squeezed harder in annoyance. The target looked around for anyone to help it. All it saw was the blue boy, and another boy with blonde hair. Blonde boy was watching him with sympathetic eyes, but made no more to help him. He had never felt so betrayed. Naruto watched the scene and shook his head. There was no way he was going to be the one to grab Tora again. Target captured, Naruto said. Kakashi nodded, as he glanced through his book, leaning against the tree. Are you sure this is the target, Tora? Ribbon on the left ear? He asked lazily. Just how long is this cat going to live? I swear the Hokage was complaining about chasing it back when he was still a genin. He thought with a grimace. He himself still remembered that demon cat, though he couldn't blame it. Yes, positive. Naruto's voice came over the earpiece. Grinning happily, Kakashi snapped his book closed, placing his hand to the earpiece. Excellent. Missing pet, Tora, search mission complete. Kagami snorted from beside him. Don't act so happy. You didn't even do anything useful, worthless sensei, she said as she jumped from the tree. Kakashi's head dropped with a sigh. Oh, my cute little Tora-chan, I was so worried. The woman cooed out, as she cuddled the cat to her chest. Said cat cried, and tried to get out of her arms. It was dying, slowly dying. It hated this torture. Sakura watched the cat with an expression of vengeance, though she kept a polite smile on her face. That damned cat deserves it. Just how many times are we going to go after that cursed thing? I don't get how no team has accidentally killed it just yet. How is it even still alive? With how much that woman squeezes it. Not to mention, from what I've heard, that cat was alive when the Hokage was a genin. How is that even possible? She wondered, watching the cat be squeezed to the woman's chest. Inner Sakura was cackling and sticking pins in a voodoo doll of the cat. Sasuke stood sideways, watching the scene in disinterest. This had all happened before. Only this time it had been Sakura to catch the cat. Usually he was the first to it. Although he felt disappointed that he hadn't completed the mission, he was relieved he hadn't been the one to get clawed at. The only one that hadn't caught it was Naruto. He never seemed to get to the scene on time. He would have accused him of purposely being slow. However, if he did, Kagami would use him as senbon practice again. Naruto just watched sadly as the poor thing was tortured. He felt bad for it. It was no wonder it always ran away. He shook the thoughts away and turned to more important thoughts. Naruto was thinking about what would be happening next. He couldn't wait. He would get to meet Haku again, and Kagami already knew Zabuza. That would help things along this time around. At least he hoped so. Kagami had gone out of her way to accept her contract with him this time, for Naruto's sake. At least this outfit isn't as bad as the one I had, he thought, picking at his sleeve. Kagami's hand drifted up the place her chakra had been. It had stood out, and she had to forget the past. She no longer needed a sign of ownership. After all, she didn't belong to anyone. Still, she felt oddly exposed without it. She couldn't wait for the Chunin exams. She missed her old red kimono. They had agreed she could start wearing it at the exam. Blood wouldn't show up as easily on it anyway. Right now red would just gain too much attention, and Sakura already did that with her outfit. No, Kagami would stick with her blue outfit for a while longer. Kakashi merely stood there with a blank expression. That poor cat, he thought. He wondered if it would ever be free from that woman. She might be the Fire Lord's wife, but she wasn't the best with animals. Sarutobi leant back in his chair. His pipe rested in his mouth, as the smoke swirled up and clung along the ceiling. He picked up a paper on his desk, and allowed his eyes to skim over it. Now, Team 7, led by Kakashi. Your next mission is, he said, trailing off and glancing over the paper once more. Babysitting an elder's grandson, shopping in the neighboring village, help with the potato digging, and helping Maida guy find his missing outfit. He muttered. Kakashi froze and twitched slightly. His outfit is missing? Then what? Kakashi's face lost all color and he swayed slightly. A tall male went running down the street, with a bathrobe on. Behind him was a mini-him, in a green leotard. Come Lee, even if I have lost the outfit of youth, we must still continue. He shouted, as he turned his head and grinned at the other. His teeth glinting in the sunlight. The mini-him nodded back, face serious. Of course, sensei. That fact that you would continue even with only a robe, proves you are in the springtime of youth. He shouted happily. The man cried, tears falling down his face. "I have taught you well, my pupil. You too pick it up," he called to the other members of the team. Both were running after him. The female was wearing a large jacket, which had the hood pulled over her face, and a hockey mask. The male was wearing a cloak. He had on a pair of sunglasses and a fake mustache. His hair had been pulled up and stuffed into a hat. Both had the same thought. "I don't know them. I don't know them. At least no one can guess who I am." They both blanched when Lee suggested trading his outfit for a robe as well. "Oh God, no. I think I'm going to be sick," Kakashi thought. No. Everyone turned their attention to the team before them. And to the shock of those in the room, it had been Kagami who spoke. She was picking at her nails, cleaning what looked to be blood from under them. Though they couldn't be sure if that is where she was looking, after all she did wear her headband over her eyes. The new plates on the back of her gloves glinted in the light. "We have completed the necessary amount of D-rank missions for a C-rank mission at least. And I do believe I requested the next C rank we could receive," she said. Sakura jerked from her thoughts and turned to look at her with wide eyes. What is she thinking? You can't refuse the Hokage. She's going to get us into trouble, she thought, panicking. Inner Sakura was quiet as she usually was around Kagami. She wanted to demand that she show the Hokage the proper respect he deserved. However, if there was one thing she had come to learn, it was that Kagami was stronger than her. She kept her mouth shut though. There was no reason to get on her bad side again. Naruto blinked, tilting his head in thought. His eyes brightened when he added up the time frames. "Haku, I'll get to see you again soon," he thought, smiling softly. Sasuke turned to the Hokage with a serious expression. "I must agree. These D-rank missions are getting us nowhere. We can already work like a team if needed." And Kagami explained that was what D-rank missions were for. "At the very least, could you give us a chance to prove ourselves?" he asked. Naruto glanced at Sasuke and smiled slightly, turning back to Hiruzen. "Sasuke and Oni-san's right. How can we ever show you that we are ready for harder things if you don't give us a chance to prove ourselves? We have come a long way for the short time we have been together. The training we have done proves that we can work together. All we ask for is a chance," he said. Sakura looked at her teammates in slight shock. She looked down, smiling softly. "We have all kind of become friends. Even though Sasuke hates Naruto, he doesn't care if I make friends with him. And now that we're on a team together, I don't have any excuses. Since I asked Sasuke for some taijutsu tips, he's been a bit nicer in me. At least he notices me from time to time now. And although Kagami hates me, she had never hurt me. She's even given me advice. We do make a good team," she thought, smiling brighter. She looked up with a determined expression. "I agree with my teammates. If we are supposed to be a genin team, then we need to see how far our trust in one another goes. And how good our skills have improved. And how else can we do that? Then by new situations and chances to prove ourselves," she said in a steely voice. Kakashi couldn't help but blink at the team. They weren't best friends, but they did help one another. Everything he had seen so far was that of a true team. He couldn't help but feel proud of them. In the very beginning they had been a bit awkward and unsure of each other. Kagami's blatant hatred for them, though her protectiveness and obsessive tendencies toward Naruto. Sasuke's disinterest, although he showed rivalry with Naruto and interest in Kagami. He had even started helping Sakura when she asked, because he didn't want to be held back. Sakura was in an awkward stage of leaving her fangirl self behind to become a true kunoichi. He had a feeling that Genjutsu Kagami had used on her their first training session had something to do with it. She had been trying harder ever since. Naruto seemed to be making an effort. At times he seemed to avoid the two of them. Kakashi thought it was just a part of the boy's shy nature that he had read about. But sometimes he gained this haunted look, as if he was afraid of them or of what would happen if he got too close. They did work perfectly as a team, however, and he couldn't be prouder to be their sensei. The room was silent. Even Iruka couldn't think of anything to say. They had given very good reasons to be given a C-rank mission. Even Sasuke and Sakura had agreed on it. And most shocking of all, Kagami had suggested it. Iruka knew she was only a genin for probation, so he knew their team was better off than others. However, he still worried. What if something happened to them? What if they were hurt? Naruto was like a little brother to him, and he had grown fond of Kagami. She always came to him if she needed help or advice. It wasn't often, but it was enough. And he knew they were for the future. They had told him bits and pieces. The Hokage himself had said it was all true. While they hadn't told him everything he knew about what the future was like. And even though they had survived all that, they were still his ex-students. Still people he worried and cared about. He didn't want to see any of them hurt. He couldn't help but lean back and sigh in his chair. There was nothing he could do. It was up to the Hokage. Are you sure about this? He asked, looking at them with serious eyes, concern and desperation swirling in them. Sarutobi hid his face with his hat to hide his smile, as Sakura filched slightly but kept her face straight, and Sasuke looked off to the side. Naruto slowly smiled brightly at him, and Kagami turned her gaze toward him. Together all four nodded, causing him to sigh. Iruka glanced at the Hokage and sat back in his seat correctly. The Hokage sighed, and leaned forward in his seat again. All right, he called calmly. Looking up he smiled at the four. You've stated your case. However, it's not only up to me, he said. Sarutobi looked over the team a last time. As long as your sensei agrees, he said. Sakura looked up at the Hokage in surprise, while Sasuke's eyes widened slightly. They turned to look at Kakashi. Naruto coping their emotions with a small smile, while Kagami's face seemed to be turned toward the window. Kakashi blinked slowly and reached up, rubbing his chin. Of course, I don't think AC rank will be a problem, he said with an eye smile. These 3-4 have proven that they can take care of themselves, just now. Not that, but I think a change of scenery will do them good. It's only an escort mission, and the new experience should help them toward their teamwork if something comes up, he said happily. Naruto couldn't help but blink slowly in slight shock. Kakashi never spoke that way before, but I guess things could be explained better. Originally the council ordered him to train Sasuke. This time I'm close to the council, and learning of my past, they aren't in a hurry to give Sasuke power again. So that order never came. And although the changes have been small and minor, things have changed this time around. We are a better team, he thought slowly and smiled brightly at his sensei instead. Seems I won't suffer too badly this time around, he thought. Sakura just stared in shock. He actually agreed. We get a higher mission, she thought in shock. Hell yay. Now we can start proving ourselves. Show that we aren't that weak little girl anymore. We'll gain the others' respect and become stronger, inner Sakura shouted, causing a small smile to appear on Sakura's face. Sasuke merely smirked. Finally a chance to prove myself. If I can prove I'm ready, we can get stronger missions, and stronger missions means I get stronger. And he would be one step closer to killing Itachi, he thought. Though I can't forget about restoring my clan. If I don't do that and face Itachi, if by some chance I die, then there will be nothing left of my clan. So I have to get strong and start recreating my clan, he thought with a nod, crossing his arms and closing his eyes. Kagami continued to stare out the window. I wonder if Itachi will want beef stew tonight or another rice dish. I'll have to remember to buy some ramen as well. We've all gained an addiction to the junk. We can't go a meal without it. That and Pocky, but that's more Itachi's fault than anything, she thought. Sarutobi leant forward as he laced his fingers together. I'll give you the C-ranked mission you asked for. It's the protection missions for a certain individual, he said, with a slight smile. He had a feeling Naruto had been waiting for this. He would have to thank Kagami for reminding him of this mission. The team's attention was drawn back to the Hokage. Sakura stood there, a determined gleam to prove herself in her eyes. Sasuke stood with his hands in his pockets. Naruto stood at attention and smiled slightly at the Hokage. Kagami turned her attention from the window, tilting her head in wait. Kakashi stood there, slouched over from the shock of it all. He had not expected this to happen so easily. He thought the Hokage would have put up more of a fight. He usually would. Sarutobi nodded, and turned his head back to the door. Hey, will you come in here, please? He asked. The door was slowly opened by scarred hands, and a bottle of alcohol. What's this? The figure asked as they entered the room completely. It was a male. He looked to be around 40 or 50. He had glasses and short gray hair, and a rope tied around his head. He swayed slightly as he stood and reeked of alcohol. They're a bunch of super brats. How are they supposed to protect me? He asked. He turned his attention to the three midgets again, especially the shortest one with the weird face. Not to mention the blind girl. What use could she possibly be? One looks like a bubblegum princess who probably can't even hold a weapon, and the other looks weak and girly. Are they really ninja? He asked, in disbelief. Naruto blinked slowly and sighed. It would seem that he would always be short. At least this time his jumpsuit wasn't insulted. Although I suppose dark blue, red, and burnt orange isn't as bad as neon orange, red, creme, and navy blue. At least it doesn't burn anyone's eyes. He thought. Sasuke glared at the fool. How dare he call me girly? He thought, seething. Perhaps a misplaced kunai would change his mind? Sakura grit her teeth and clenched her fists. I'll show him bubblegum princess. She thought. Inner Sakura was hissing and cursing in anger. However, she was also a bit disappointed that even someone she didn't know thought she looked weak. Kakashi's eyes smiled at the man. Although they are beginners, they really are ninjas, he said, happily. Although he couldn't help but shiver at the killing intent rising from Sakura and Sasuke. He was prepared to stop them if they tried to attack. The male arched a brow and sniffed slightly away from them. We'll see about that. I am the super expert bridge builder Tazuna. I expect you to provide me super protection until I get back to my country and complete the bridge, he said, as he stared down the three children. Naruto offered a polite smile. Might I ask where we are escorting you? He asked, calmly. Tazuna blinked and shrugged. Wave country. Naruto nodded once more. However, inside he was jumping up and down and grinning. He would get to see Haku soon. A few minutes later Kakashi dismissed the team. He had decided to leave tomorrow, to give everyone time to prepare. After deciding a time, the team split up. Sasuke heading home. Sakura starting to stalk Sasuke, but changing her mind and heading to the training ground. Kakashi to stock up on books. And Naruto to with Kagami to have lunch, then head home to spend time with Itachi and tell him what they were doing tomorrow. Black eyes opened slowly, only to be closed in exhaustion a moment later. Blue hair fanned out around the pale face on the pillow, falling over pale features as they turned their head. A few deep sighs escaped pale lips, as the body tensed slightly. The sheets ruffled slightly as the figure tried to move, only to stop weaker than before. A groan that could be mistaken for a whimper escaped, as they tried to dig their head into the pillow. A pale hand reached up and rested lightly on the slightly sweaty forehead. Black eyes opened slowly and locked with pale green. Kimi, she mumbled slightly, her hand coming up to grip his own. Kimimaro frowned lightly as he stared down at Aiko. How are you feeling? He asked, his other hand coming up to brush through lengthened hair. Black eyes blinked slowly as she tried to put the words to his lip movements. A small twitch happened and she sighed, closing her eyes, body untensing. Fine, she said lowly. Her eyes slipped closed for a moment. I guess I'm disappointed, she muttered. Kimimaro frowned, looking at her. Why is that? He asked as he sat on the edge of the bed. A twist of the lips showed dry amusement and self-loathing. If Mistress Kagami had been there, I wouldn't have been able to protect her, she said. Kimimaro tilted his head in slight confusion. Why are you so loyal to her? He asked. The twist of her lips softened to something more real. Because, she saved me, made me useful. She was my savior as I was yours, she said, smiling at him softly. Kimimaro blinked, his face gaining a slight pink tint before he smiled back. I see, he said. They stay there lost in thoughts and enjoying each other's company, hands intertwined. Mirror-like orbs reflected the moon almost as they were a reflection of the moon themselves. Silver bangs brushed past translucent skin. Black hair shifted slightly from behind strong curved shoulders. A sigh escaped colorless lips as eyes closed. The face lowered and the body fell back to land lightly against the wall behind her. A peach-colored hand came up, resting over the eyes and helped block everything out. Pale hands reached up, seeking the other's clothing and latched on like a child would. Deep breaths were taken as blood slipped between peach fingers and down translucent cheeks. Itachi. Colorless lips mumbled, blood sliding past them. Black eyes watched the pale figure. Blood-stained and fragile in appearance. In none of his lives, the past, the present, the future. In none of them had he ever seen her in such a shape. Then again, she had never allowed anyone to see the consequences of her bloodline. Sure, the blood would fall, but she would usually remain strong and stone-like until she left. Now he can see why pain and Madara separated her bloodline usages so far. She looked broken, and that was just something he could never think she could be. She had done nothing but use her bloodline since she had returned to this time, it would seem. She had used them on Kimimaro. She had used them to make sure Pain had all his memories. She had used it on both of them to give them memories of after their deaths. She had used it to merge Aiko and Naruto's souls. She had used it to prove that her and Naruto's story was true. And now she was using it to find those that would be needed to awaken. It was all slowly killing her. The guilt was destroying him. Kira, he muttered lowly. Her reaction was enough to cause him to sigh. Even so damaged she could push it aside when angered. I hate that name, she muttered. Itachi hummed slightly, leaning down and resting his forehead on hers. He dropped his hand and their eyes locked. And we both know that's not true. You hate the past that comes with that name, of being weak and helpless. He muttered as her eyes slowly focused a bit more. Just as I know you're coming to hate your new name. After all, Madara is the one that named you Kagami. You might have to choose between the two one day. And Kira you can begin anew with. Start the clan your mother wanted, instead of what your father destroyed. He stated, handing coming to rest on her head. Kagami blinked slowly up at him. Maybe, she said sluggishly. A harsh laugh escaped her lips and Itachi finally noticed she was trembling. He pulled back and frowned at her in confusion. Athena? He questioned. She gulped, lips trembling into a mockery of a smile. I found his soul, and I've locked onto it. I can awaken him as planned, she said, trailing off, as her shaking grew. Itachi watched in concern. He had never seen her react like this. I'm scared, she mumbled, causing Itachi to freeze. I'm so damned scared. Of finding out, she said and started laughing with a hysterical note in her voice. I'm so, pathetically scared. She declared, her hands coming to cover her eyes as sobs escaped her throat. Of what he meant in that damned confession, she choked out. Itachi watched with wide eyes as she broke down. His eyes drifted toward Naruto, who stood at the porch archway. His eyebrows furrowed and his expression the same as Itachi's. And they knew each other was thinking the same thing. Just what did Kakashi tell her? Pain watched the messenger bird leave. His mind was filled with thoughts, plots, and memories. He frowned lightly as he leaned back in his chair. I've been blind, haven't I? How could I possibly think taking control of everything would bring peace? Some would rather die than be controlled. And even if this generation or lifetime came to accept it, eventually they would rebel even if it's in the distant future. It was foolish. Jiraiya-sensei and Naruto were right. We need to end the cycle of violence. Not use it to finish it all once and for all. He thought as he watched the rainfall. A small smirk crossed his lips. It will be interesting to face him again. I hope Naruto is training harder. The invasion will happen again. I need Madara to believe I'm on his side, until then. And also, I might trust Naruto, and I might believe in him and the dream. But Naruto has changed, as had all three of them. I need to make sure he hasn't strayed from his path. That he hasn't lost sight of what we're fighting for. So we will meet again in battle. He thought, a smile crossing his lips. I can't wait, he said, thinking of the boy again. Pain looked up to see Conan watching him with a small smile. He and Itachi had told her of the past. She had sighed and admitted that she hadn't thought it would work. Pain knew that though. Conan had always been a gentler person. But her desire to stay by his side had kept her with him. And her loyalty and belief in him had caused her to do as he said. She still remained at his side, but he was beginning to wonder if she would leave. She had been giving him hints of something lately. He is the chosen one. Vital to the future and the one that will bring peace. I find him to be on my mind rather often, he said, glancing out the window. A small smirk crossed Conan's lips. Oh really? Are you positive that excuse is the reason? She asked slowly in a sly tone. Pain looked at her with frown of confusion. What other reason would there be? He asked. The smirk grew before she shook her head. You'll find out one day, she said, before turning. It's time to practice using your real body, Nagato, she said. Pain smiled slightly. Perhaps everything is for the best. I missed that name, more than I realized, he thought as he followed her from the office. Deidara frowned lightly as her held the clay in his hand. Kira, or Kagami as she called herself now. I remember when she was banished. I never found out why she was banished. I only remember when she left. She told me to find my purpose, to not be merely satisfied with what I had. To find something that made me fulfilled. For a while I hadn't understood. Then I heard about the Kenjutsu. After that I couldn't help but follow in her footsteps. Like she said, I was satisfied in Iwagakure. But I soon came to feel unsatisfied and trapped. He thought, watching the mouth swallow the clay. I was shocked to see her here. I heard she had become a mercenary, like I had a terrorist bomber. I knew when I heard about Athena, was her. That had always been her nickname. So seeing she was a part of Akatsuki had been a shock. And it was so strange seeing her. She was so serious and emotionless. That is until I gained my ring. Then she went back to glomping me and calling me, DD. He thought, clenching his eyes shut and an anger mark appearing on his head. My name's not DD. He suddenly shouted, jumping up as the anger became too much. Sounds like you're in denial. Itachi muttered from his spot of fixing the polish. Pain was very serious about the nail polish. If it got chipped and he saw, you got a training session with him. Shut up, Deidara hissed. He was still sore about being beaten by him. Not to mention Kira had taken to calling him big brother. That had always been his position. Not that he was jealous, not. Whatever you say, DD. Kisame snickered from his position standing behind Itachi. Itachi paused mid-stroke. Kisame. Yay? He muttered lazily. You should run, Itachi said, returning to his polish. Kisame blinked and looked up at the killing intent he finally noticed. His eyes widened, seeing Deidara's clay dragon behind him already. Deidara glared at him. Only Kira can call me DD. He shouted as they attacked. Kisame started dodging and jumping around. I thought you just said you weren't DD? He shouted back. I'm not. Deidara screamed as those damned spiders joined the fray. But you just sigh. I know what I said. I'm not DD, he said, making the seal. Katsu. Sasori held his head as the explosion rocked the building. Why was I partnered with him again? He asked his newest puppet. He had just finished it today, so he should have guessed this would happen. Deidara and the others had promised to stay calm while he was working after all. His gaze drifted to the building as smoke rose from it and was relieved he had decided to move everything outside for the final test. I'll only have to replace a few tools this time, he thought. Kakuzu grumbled as he started adding up the estimate. Waste of money. Can't they at least take their fights outside? He mumbled, trying to figure out the cost for repairs. And he had been so happy Hidan was on a sacred trip too. He had just come from a mission he had talked the client into double paying. Now that money would be put to use. But not his use. Nagato's eyebrow twitched as he took in the destruction around him. Conan had stopped any damage from happening to him. This body was still too malnourished and weak to do anything. At least the foundation wasn't completely destroyed this time. Conan mused as she called back her paper. And your office was destroyed, so your paperwork will be missing, she said with a dissatisfied frown. Nagato blinked and stopped glaring. Maybe it's not a bad thing. He thought, hope appearing in his eyes. A piece of hard concrete rubble fell, bashing him in the head. Hinata sighed, closing her eyes. She took deep breaths, finding her focus. She needed to relax and allow herself to be completely calm. Tranquil, serene, like a calm pond or stream. She took a breath in and slowly released it. Her bloodline allowed her to attack a person's chakra. Kagami Sensei's jutsus taught her crystallization. Together they were a deadly combination. She had to keep calm. Using the crystallization jutsus with emotion would just injure the user. Kagami Sensei said she had to be calm, completely and utterly unaffected. She gathered the strike in her hand and thrust out. She heard the sound of something shattering and opened her eyes in surprise. The water bottle had crystallized and shattered when she aimed with the gentle fist. It hadn't frozen, but seemed to be made up of thousands of tiny little ice shards. A smile spread across her face. Kurenai was smiling happily at her and clapping lightly. Kiba was shouting and cheering for her. Shino was watching and nodding his head with a small smile. Hinata turned her attention to the last of the group. Kagami stood there with her head tilted and lips twitched upward slightly. She had told Hinata why she had wanted to stop by and leave a scroll for her and test her. She and her team were leaving for AC rank. They hadn't told the others because they didn't want any problems or jealousy. Kagami nodded in satisfaction. Perfect, sunny place, she called out. She walked over, handing out the scroll. I'll check up on you in about 2 weeks and see how far you've gotten. You've made great progress. Only one other person besides myself has ever been able to use these techniques, she said with a slight smile. Hinata blushed happily and took the scroll with a deep bow. Thank you, sensei. I promise I won't let you down, she declared, clenching her fists near her chest. Kagami nodded and reached over, ruffling the girl's hair for a moment. "Thank you Kurenai-san, for allowing me to test her," she said. Kurenai nodded. "Good luck on your mission," she said with a nod. Kagami nodded once more and vanished in a puff of smoke. The needles flew through the air with a deadly accuracy. They slammed into the targets perfectly or closely enough. Tenten's shoulders dropped slightly at seeing the few that were off mark. Even with Lee and Guy cheering her on, she couldn't help but feel disappointed. "Don't be so angry." Tenten jerked her head up to her new sensei. Senbon is one of the hardest and dangerous weapons to use. One slip and you could end up killing the target instead of disabling. "You have to remain calm," she said, making her way closer to the group. Neji looked at the girl in confused interest while Lee's eyes brightened and he ran over. "Kagami-chan," he called a tackle glomp, sending him clinging to her. Guy was blinking and smiled slightly at seeing Lee's best friend again. Neji was frowning slightly at his teammates' antics. Lee was eccentric, but he had always been polite. The only one he had ever seen Lee hug was Guy, and this wasn't one of those creepy ones. He was further confused when she just allowed him to cling to her. Tenten, however, was watching the scene in confusion. "Kagami-sensei, you know Lee?" she asked in confusion. Lee dropped his hug and stepped back with wide eyes. "Sensei," he shouted, looking between the two of them. Neji's frown had deepened even further at Tenten's claim. Hearing his teammate call the girl sensei seemed to bring back a memory of something. Guy blinked in shock. "You mean this is your master Tenten?" he asked. Tenten jerked around and smiled sheepishly. "Hi, this is Kagami-sensei. She said I could call her teacher instead of master. I am her apprentice, but since I'm also on a team, she said it wouldn't be right. I completely forgot to tell you about her. Gomen," she said, bowing slightly. Guy suddenly grinned. "Well, isn't this a wonderful circle of youth? Kagami-san is Tenten's teacher and Lee's best friend," he declared. Tenten blinked and turned to Kagami. "Lee's your best friend?" she asked, slightly shocked. Kagami nodded slowly. "Yes, Lee-kun is my best friend, after Anbu Kitsune and my brother. Then again, they are my family, so yay," she said as if trying to understand herself. Neji and Tenten just looked between the two, feeling their brains about to explode. It just didn't make any sense. Kagami shook her head and handed out a scroll. "I'll be busy for the next 2 weeks. This scroll holds your training programs and some skills for you to study up on. It also contains a storage seal with some diluted poisons. You idolized Tsunade-sama, and so I added some of her healing and fighting techniques," she said. Tenten's eyes widened and she grabbed the scroll, hugging it closely. "Thank you," she said with stars shining in her eyes. Tenten would never be a medic nin, but she could learn the basics and their fighting styles. Kagami nodded. "Well, I have to go. It was nice meeting the rest of you. Bye Tenten, Lee-kun," she said before vanishing in a poof of smoke. Neji couldn't help but frown after her. "Something about her is familiar," he muttered. Tenten glanced in his direction and shrugged, opening her scroll. "I would think so. She's also your cousin Hinata's teacher," she said, causing the boy to freeze. Kagami opened her eyes and sighed as she stretched. "Everything done?" She blinked to see Itachi standing at her doorway. She nodded slowly. "Yay," Ibiki-sama was told. "Anko is already busy with the new meat." Tenten had her scrolls, as does the sunny place. She said as she pushed herself to stand. "There's nothing left but to get ready for the mission," she said, her hands clasped in her lap and eyes lowered. A small smirk crossed her face even as eyes remained blank. "I guess it will be good to have someone else not be affected by my bloodline," she muttered lowly. Itachi frowned slightly as he watched and closed his eyes, sighing. "At least Naruto will be there. I think Kakashi will want to spend time with him as well. So, who am I kidding? This is going to be a disaster," he thought as he grabbed his mask. Placing it on, he left for his own mission. Kagami sighed and walked over to her vanity. Sitting there was a box the Hokage had given her before she left his office the previous day. Opening it, she couldn't stop the chuckle that escaped her lips. "This way, Zabuza won't recognize me right away. I can't let Kakashi know I'm Athena just yet. After all, she is a very famous and powerful mercenary," she thought, grabbing the porcelain from the container. Itachi suddenly snorted in amusement. "Is something wrong, Kitsune?" the Hokage asked as his teammates looked at him in slight shock. Itachi shook his head and bowed slightly. "Forgive me, Hokage-sama, I was just remembering something amusing, he stated respectfully. His hand went through the seals to heal the injuries his clone had gained. It was easier than making a new one. Those clones were hard and draining as hell to make. Kagami hummed lightly as she finished the meal. Cooking had been something she had become very interested in lately. Maybe it was because tea reminded her of her poisons. She couldn't remember anyone cooking when she was younger. It had been the family cooks, and when she had been in Iwa it had been takeout. She had to admit though, home-cooked food was just better somehow. She looked up when Naruto walked through the door. "Did you say your goodbyes?" she asked, turning back to the stove. Naruto looked up and smiled. "Yep, Shino and Hinata wished me good luck. Shika said I was troublesome, but he had gotten used to it. So I better not die or anything bothersome," he said with a slight grin. Kagami snorted slightly. "Some people never will change, will they? Nara was the same in our time. And after she got over her crush on you, the sunny place was a mother hen," she said, as she turned off the stove. Naruto sat down and grinned. "Iruka said you better not come home with any injuries. Your lack of pain has him worried you're going to let yourself get attacked. You do like collecting scars," he said, placing his elbows on the table. "Only if they're interesting," she muttered, bringing breakfast to the table. "Eat fast or we'll be late," she said. The sun rose slowly over the village hidden in the leaves. The gates to the village had long been opened. The shinobi already in position standing guard while travelers were already packed and moving on. It was a quiet and slow day. Nothing extremely interesting was happening. Most villagers weren't even up yet. And those that were had decided to do their shopping and chores later in the day. A group was currently making their way from the gates. A middle-aged man dressed to travel, followed by a pink-haired girl and blue-haired boy. Behind them were a blonde-haired boy and a gray-haired man. A silver and black-haired girl brought up the back of their little group. They all walked silently along the trail from the village. That is until the pink-haired girl asked about if Wave had shinobi, causing the sensei to start explaining things. Sakura nodded. "I see. So we won't be facing any enemies. That's a relief for our first time out, I guess. Although we did ask for this mission to prove ourselves," she said, crossing her arms with a sigh. Kakashi couldn't help but chuckle and reach out, patting her head. "Don't worry so much. This mission is to prove you can handle C-ranked. Maybe our next one will involve an escort to a ninja village," he said, gaining a slight smile and nod from the girl. Sasuke turned back and blinked at the serious expression on their client's face. There was something suspicious about that look. Naruto kept his head down and hid a sigh. He knew he was being impatient. But he had wanted to do this a different way for so long. Now he had the chance to fix things, he just wanted to see Haku. Kagami kept silent as she followed the rest from the back. She kept her distance from Kakashi. So far she had ignored all of his questions when he spoke to her. Kakashi had noticed this, but couldn't figure out why. Things had been fine when they left the previous day. He was confused. She didn't like him, she didn't like anyone really. But she had always been polite nonetheless. Having her suddenly be rude and uncooperative was strange. And he never knew how to deal with her to begin with. This attitude she had would be a problem if she allowed it to interfere with her skills. However, she didn't, so he couldn't pull rank and demand what was wrong. Not that he would, but it bothered him for some reason. Everything she did since they had met had bothered him. Sakura brought her fist down on her open palm. "Oh right," she said and turned to Kagami. She watched her for a few moments before finally gathering the courage. "So, what is the mask for?" she asked, turning to Kagami. When she had asked Naruto, he had said he didn't know. The white porcelain mask glinted slightly in the sunlight as it turned toward her. It was blank, all except for the black streaks that went diagonally down the face through the eyes. The Kahona symbol was etched into the forehead, and her headband was missing completely. Kagami was wearing the same clothing. She had even decided to go with a backpack like them instead of her normal scrolls. The mask was featureless except for the black-covered eyeholes. "We are going to Wave Country. A land surrounded by a sea. My headband is needed to cover my eyes at all times. If it became wet it would become useless. This way I don't have to worry about my eyes being uncovered. This mask was made by Hokage-sama. The markings mean that I am neither a hunter nin nor Anbu, but that I am merely wearing one," she said. A few moments of having Naruto stare at her caused her to cough. "And the mask keeps yet another part of me separated from the water. I have a distinct dislike of water. shrugging her shoulders. The group paused however, Sakura and Sasuke staring at her in a mixture of surprise and shock. Naruto satisfied and nodding. Tazuna had raised an eyebrow at the admission. Kakashi however, merely froze and was looking at her with widened eyes. "You have a fear of water?" he asked slowly. Kagami however hooked her arm with Naruto's and walked past him with a slight humph. "Pathetic sensei," she muttered, causing the man's head to drop again. "So what are you going to do about Tenten?" Naruto asked as they led the group. "I'm not sure. I can show her how to use every weapon in existence, true enough. However, Tenten has always looked up to Tsunade. She's not talented with healing jutsus. And they never really learned because Neji's a Hyuga. I've always found that foolish. And really aside from the fact that Neji wanted to protect you, and Lee and Guy were too obsessed with the fight. That's why they were the first team to go. Even Yamanaka-san knew healing jutsus. And the lack of talent can be made up with willpower and perseverance. I think having Tsunade train her would be best," she muttered. Naruto tilted his head and thought. That would be a good idea. And Tenten would work harder than anyone. To be the best, and because she would be trained by her idol. "Is that your plan?" he asked. Kagami nodded. "Yes, I'll continue to train her. Mainly with weapons, poisons, and chakra scalpels, until Tsunade returns to Konoha. Then I can work on getting her to agree and take Tenten on as a student. If the council hadn't asked me to take two, I would only train the sunny place. Ino has already started training with Anko-sama, so I'll just have to find someone else after Tsunade takes Tenten on." "When does she come back anyway? After Sarutobi death, correct?" he asked. Naruto nodded, and they walked silently. "You're making sure the team never happens again," he said. Kagami blinked looking toward him in confusion. "I've noticed it since our team was assigned. We don't fit the Team 7 legacy anymore. You've been changing it. Sakura is no longer a mini Tsunade. Sasuke isn't as obsessive, and I'm not as happy and foolish. And you've been doing it. You broke Sasuke's pride by beating him in a spar. You've broken Sakura's mind in that genjutsu. I found out you requested to be on my team. They could have sent you to one of the civilian teams, to make sure they actually passed and became something. But instead you requested ours. You're making it so we aren't the second Sanins this time around," he said looking at her with a serious expression. Kagami sighed. "True," she said, "while you'll still train with Jiraiya-sama, and Sakura with Tsunade, you won't be their doubles, you won't be their second coming. It won't be like before. And Sasuke will still leave. That is one of the things that we can't change," she said with a sympathetic expression. "However, the outcome of that fight doesn't have to be like it was," she said. Naruto frowned slightly and started to think as they dropped back, allowing the group to pass. "Don't worry about all of this now, Naru," Kagami said, her eyes drifting ahead, causing Naruto to look. Kagami's gaze drifted down toward the puddle coming up. She couldn't help but arch a brow at the souls within. Is this really a technique used? You would think they would be smarter? She wondered. She watched as Kakashi glanced at it and sighed in annoyance. Using this for a test is smart, but it's also annoying, she thought as she walked forward, keeping pace with Naruto. Naruto himself was grinning slightly. "Soon. We can begin everything soon," he thought, glancing at Kagami. "I know Haku would join us. He had never been one for killing," he thought in slight regret, remembering Haku's fate. Sakura and Sasuke continued on with the client as they passed over the puddle. Kagami closed her eyes with a sigh, while Naruto's hand slipped into his kunai pouch. Kakashi started adding chakra for the hand seal. All three heard the sound of the water moving, and the brothers shooting form it. The chains wrapped around Kakashi in an instant. Kakashi's eyes widened as he watched the chains tighten, coiling around his body. "What?" he exclaimed, finally catching everyone's attention. Sakura's head jerked around and she looked at their sensei with wide eyes. "What is this?" she asked in confusion and horror. Kakashi had just said they shouldn't have to deal with any shinobi, let alone from mist. Sasuke also jerked to attention, his hand shooting to his kunai pouch as he tried to understand the situation. How did they sneak up on us like that? He could help but wonder, frowning slightly. Naruto's face broke into a smile before it turned serious. Just because this was the beginning didn't mean that he couldn't take things seriously. As Kagami had pounded into his head, just because he knew what would happen didn't mean he knew everything. Kagami sighed, and moved back from the group, pausing beside a tree. Her head shifted, the eyeholes landing on the figure in the tree. A quick second later she turned back to the scene before her, just as the chains were pulled. One down. One of the brothers called as they sliced the Junin to pieces. Kakashi-sensei, Sasuke shouted as he watched the scene. The blood flying and splattering everywhere. At least he had seen the blood when they ripped him apart. His eyes narrowed in anger at the sight. Kakashi-sensei, Sakura shouted with wide eyes. This can't be happening, she thought. Her hand trembled for a moment before she shoved it into her kunai pouch, pulling one out. I won't be weak. I won't be defenseless. But how can we win? These guys just killed Kakashi-sensei, she thought, moving to stand in front of Tazuna. Tazuna watched in horror at what was happening in front of him. Because of him, Naruto stood with his head lowered. Now he could see it. The only thing laying there was the pieces of wood. Two down. The man called as they appeared behind him. Suddenly Naruto turned to them with a grin on his face. I've been waiting for you. He sneered. His leg came up, kicking one in the face, completely removing his mask. While his fist landed in the other's gut. Sasuke finished his move, the shrunken snapping the chain toward the tree and jerking the two male along to ground with it. His kunai locked it into place. Landing on their backs, he did a drop kick on each one, causing them to bounce off of the ground and into the air slightly. He landed in a crouch even as they unhooked the chain from their gauntlets. They both ran around the site. One headed toward Tazuna and the girl by him, while the other headed toward Naruto, who was between them and the other two. Sakura watched in slight shock. Her eyes looked around and spotted Kagami just standing there, watching. Her eyes widened before narrowing. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her shrunken and jumped forward, making sure to stay in front of Tazuna. A second later she hurled them toward the enemy. He reached up, blocking them with his gauntlet. That was when she made her move. Slipping under the outstretched arm, she slides her arm upward with her kunai. It landed, piercing soft flesh, however she didn't have time to care about where. Her fist shot forward, smashing into his face. Although she still wasn't strong enough to send him flying, no, that was the second part. She spun on her heel, delivering a spin kick to his face and followed up with a snap kick to his torso. The combination sent him back, and she resumed her position before Tazuna. Naruto ducked under the claw, and did a sideways heel kick to the man's chin. As he was airborne, Naruto grabbed his ankle, and swung him around higher into the sky. Reaching into his bag, he grabbed 3 kunai and threw them at the target. 2 hit him in his stomach and leg, the other he blocked. Grinning, Naruto allowed him to land on the ground. That was when his clones grabbed his feet, and the last 2 delivered sucker punches to his jaw. A sickening crack was heard. The man looked up with crazed eyes and gave a battle cry as he charged again. Sasuke dashed towards Sakura and Tazuna, only to freeze as she attacked the man head-on. He snapped out of it when he watched the man stop on the heel of his foot and shoot forward again. Sasuke narrowed his eyes and ran toward them. Sakura watched him with determined eyes. She didn't have a plan this time, but she wouldn't allow him to hurt the client. She pulled out 2 kunai and held them before her with her arms crossed, crouched slightly. Closer, closer, and closer. Her eyes widened as a forearm shot out, slamming right into the enemy's throat. Kakashi-sensei, you're alive, she thought, relieved, and smiled at him. Sasuke skidded to a stop, staring at the scene with wide eyes. A second later he snorted. Show off, he thought with an eye twitch. Kakashi stood there with his arm wrapped around the male's throat. Kagami stood over the other male, who was motionless with needles sticking from his body. However, that wasn't what caused the group to collectively sweat drop when they looked over. The comedy came from the fact that she had Naruto in a tight hug and his face pressed to her chest. She was running her hand through his hair and cooing something to him as he tried to escape. Naruto's arms and legs were flailing around as he tried to escape. Although Kagami wasn't as tall as Kakashi or Tazuna, she was the tallest of the group. She stood at 5 feet 2 inches while the others ranged from 5 feet 0 inches to 4 feet 7. Naruto being the shortest and Sasuke the tallest. It was strange, as when she had joined the academy she had been just as short as Naruto. Kakashi especially was twitching violently at the scene for some reason. Now then, let's get going. Although, Kakashi paused with another twitch. Did you have to use so many needles, Kagami? We could have finished earlier if you had, he said with his arms crossed. Kagami snorted from her seat on a rock as she finished cleaning her senbon. He tried to harm my Naru-chan. He's lucky. She paused holding up the senbon as it suddenly glinted with her eyes. That I didn't castrate him. She finished with a smirk, though no one saw. The whimper and flinch from her victim made it worth it though. Kakashi just sighed, while Naruto grumbled with his arms crossed. The rest of the group was standing in front of the two tied-up Mist brothers. It had been a unanimous vote. Everyone wanted to continue. Sakura had finally fought back, without it being a spar, and even then. She had always been a defensive fighter now. Now she had actually almost taken out an enemy on her own. She had refused to turn back now. Even if there was someone stronger up ahead. She finally understood why Kagami hated her. Why she tortured her with that genjutsu. She was honestly ashamed of herself. Sasuke of course wanted to continue. After all, he had to prove himself now more than ever. The No Clan Dobi had basically taken one of their enemies down. And so had Sakura. Even though she was serious now, he had never thought she had changed any yet. He didn't think she had actually gotten any stronger or better. He was slacking behind, and he would admit it had been because he had been showing off. It was the first real enemy and he had wanted to take him out with flair. He should have continued the attack, instead of pausing afterward. Naruto had refused to leave Wave as it was. He said something about going there once with the Hokage. He said he had to see for himself how bad it had gotten since. Although both, he and Kagami knew the real reason why. And Kagami hadn't said anything about it. But it was known she would always follow Naruto. Kakashi had agreed because of how proud he was. Even Sakura had done some damage. She had protected the client, and even attacked the enemy. It was so different from the defensive girl, who waited for the enemy to come to her before she did anything. Sasuke had also shown a care for his teammates when he tried to help Naruto and Sakura. Even if it appeared they didn't need it. And Naruto had been calm and energetic in the face of conflict. It had been surprising, especially seeing a move similar to Guy's and using the move he had used doing the bell test. And Kagami had proven that she could understand orders, even none spoken. She had also shown that he was right about her skill level being way above her records. She was Junin level at least, and he now believed that she was older than she looked. At first he thought she was a tall 13-year-old like the rest, but the Hokage had said she was Naruto's older sister by 2 years. So that would mean she would be 15. That sounded about right to at least be Junin level. After all, no matter what age did matter. He would have to find out her skill level. He shoved the thoughts away as said girl shoved her senbon in her pouches and stood. She nodded, causing him to eye smile. Alright kiddos and client, let's move out, he called. The group nodded in various speeds and expressions. Kagami only glanced back toward the two the Anbu would be coming for. Kagami's gaze locked on the below her. Her breathing was a bit harsh and she knew it was uneven. It was only because of her calm attitude that she was able to evade a panic attack. She had been in mist before and all. However, she still had this useless fear of water. She blamed her father and his damned Chinese water torture. Water-based attacks were the worst for her to go against. While it didn't do much damage and she could avoid it, it was a mental thing. She gulped as her hand clutching at the fabric harsher as a whimper escaped her throat. Oni-chan? Naruto said slowly. Sasuke and Sakura watched her with levels of shock and confusion. They had never seen Kagami act like this. She was usually so calm and collected. Tazuna and the boatman were also watching the scene in interest. Kagami looked up and blinked in confusion. Naruto was at the front of the boat, then what? She moved her gaze along the thing she was clutching it, until her eyes landed on a masked face. A masked face not too far above her own that belonged to a certain gray-haired bastard. Said bastard eyes smiled when he realized he was watching her. One hand was holding his book and the other at her back holding her up. She twitched violently realizing she had climbed into Kakashi's lap and was clinging to him. In a blink of an eye she was across the small boat and nuzzled into a sweat-dropping Naruto's arms. Kakashi however was crouched over trying to lessen the pain to his jewels. They all stepped up onto the dockhouse. Naruto and Kagami were taking the lead, while Kagami pulling Naruto really. She was trying to get away from the open water as fast as she could without running. Sakura and Sasuke followed close behind, while Kakashi stayed back with Tazuna. Tazuna gave his farewells to their guide, before telling Kakashi to get him home safely. Yes, yes, Kakashi agreed with a sigh. If we get attacked again, it will most likely be a Junin, not a Chunin. He thought with a sigh. His gaze drifted back to the fourth member of his team. If I'm right and she's Junin level, then we should at least survive. I suppose it will depend on the enemy. I'm a bit relieved she's hidden her skill level now. We could be in serious trouble. He thought with a frown. Although she was in a hurry to get away from the water, he could tell. She was tense, her eyes moving rapidly, and she kept a hold on Naruto and near the others. At least she knows there could be a serious threat. She's blocking Naruto's movements, so I can't tell if he's as cautious or not. Sakura and Sasuke know we might face another enemy, but a higher-leveled one hasn't entered their minds yet. He thought with a slight grimace. He was worried, however he had faith in his team. And they did want to prove themselves. There was nothing he could do but hope for the best. They moved along the area slowly. The caution they all showed causing them to slow their traveling pace. Kagami had once again moved toward the back of the group, while Naruto and Sasuke lead the front. Sakura walked with Tazuna. She had gotten the fell of protecting the old man. She wasn't about to fail now. Kakashi walked behind them. Once again, when he had tried to travel with or speak with Kagami, he was ignored. Kagami, however, suddenly stopped, looking off to a bush. The group paused, looking back at her, as she slowly made her way to the bush with her hand sneaking into her pouch. Suddenly her hand shot out. Slowly she pulled her arm back, showing that she was holding a white rabbit by its ears. Sakura, Sasuke, and Tazuna, all anime, fell at the sight. Kakashi's attention, however, was brought to the rabbit's fur. His eyes started drifting around the area. Naruto, however, made his way behind Sakura and Tazuna. She brought it up before her mask, staring at it. She sighed before jumping to the left. Kakashi's eye widened as he recognized the sound. "Everybody get down," he called out. Naruto grabbed Tazuna, pulling him down. Sasuke grabbed Sakura, pulling her down, while Kakashi crouched down, his hand already in his kunai pouch. The blade continued spinning until it slammed into a tree, almost going all the way through. Kagami's eyes drifted up, landing on the figure standing on the embedded sword. Che, he hasn't changed at all. Lack of a shirt seems to be the only difference. And since when doesn't he wear one? Must have been his idea. She thought with a sweat drop. That boy was always calling Zabuza's body beautiful. She thought with a twitch. I really don't understand, she thought with a slight frown. Kakashi's eye narrowed slightly as he caught sight of the man. This guy is, I didn't think we would encounter anyone like him. Kakashi thought with a slight frown. He could feel that Sakura and Sasuke were tense. Sakura was already reaching into her kunai pouch, while Sasuke had crouched slightly, in a stance to attack or jump back. Oddly enough, there was no tension coming from Naruto. Then again, there hadn't been when he fought the demon brothers either. Perhaps that's something she taught him. Kakashi's eye drifted slightly toward Kagami. She had merely sidestepped the blade, moving before he had even heard the blade. The rabbit was wrapped up in her arms. However, her stance was more curious than attentive, and she seemed to be thinking or gathering information somehow. It went without saying she also knew who their enemy was. Yet another mystery. Then again, she had traveled before joining Kahona. Who knows who she had met or run into? His gaze drifted back toward the man, and he stood up again, hands in his pockets. Well, Hidden Mist's missing Nin Momochi Zabuza. How nice of you to drop in, he said with an eye smile. Naruto took his eyes off of Zabuza and closed his eyes. Concentrating, he allowed Kyuubi's chakra to fill his senses. He finally pinpointed him. Haku, he thought, a small smile crossing his lips. He deactivated it and opened his eyes to see Kagami was at his side. Tazuna had been jerked to stand at between them and slightly behind her. She could protect him better from the side than front. Naruto couldn't help the glee growing in his eyes. And he could feel her returning smile, before she turned her mask back toward the others. Sasuke was frowning lightly as he glared up at the man. Something about him. This man was strong. Stronger than the fools they had faced earlier. And also, Kakashi was actually standing up straight. Almost as if he was trying to block them, protect them. Just what level is this man? Kakashi said he's a missing nin. That means he's like him. He thought, clenching his fists. Is he a killer as well? Sasuke thought with a sneer. Sakura couldn't help the droplet of sweat that slid down her face. There was something cruel about this man. Those eyes were cold, empty, almost animal-like. They reminded her of Kiba's mother. That day one of the villagers had attacked Naruto and Kiba. She had been filled with so much rage, and even though she never saw it, Kiba's mom returned covered in blood and that air around her. It had been bloodlust. Sakura knew that. And it was the same air around this man. This man could kill them easily. Everyone's head snapped up to Kakashi. Stay back. This one's on a whole different level. He's a Junin like me. Or at least he was when he became a missing nin. He's probably stronger now though. He said, deciding to be truthful. Sakura gulped, but her eyes steeled as she nodded, moving closer to Tazuna. Sasuke clenched his fist but nodded, stepping away from their sensei. Kakashi reached toward his headband. Against him, it might be a little tough, he said, grabbing the bottom of his headband. Unless I do this, he declared, holding onto the slanted part. Time. A continuous flow of unchangeable and unexplainable passage. Time is what allows the human mind to comprehend that now is no longer then. Or at least that was how Kagami had explained it. She said there was no such thing as a future on a now and then. However, I know, we have gone past the now to a point it was a then. We have seen a future. However, that future no longer exists, because we are no longer in that now, but in the then now. Just thinking about it gives me a headache. I have to wonder how she understands things like this. She once told me this. You cannot ask questions like that and expect to understand the answer. To do so you have to be insane. Maybe it's a good thing or anyone understand her when she goes on a rant. Aiko kind of does, because she's been around her so much, that insanity affect her, although not to the degree of being insane herself. In that stance she will always be alone, I believe. I think that's why she fears love of any kind. She fears the connection that comes with it. The emotion, the attachment, the thought of being so affected by one person they could destroy you. The affection she allows herself to feel is still detached in a sense. If Aiko and I were to die, she would be saddened that we were gone. However, she would move on, putting it out of mind. She's never really been attached to anything. That's why Kakashi sensei scares her. He was able to rattle her truths, destroy her world as he died. He told her those words that she hated and feared so damned much, that he destroyed her. It's so strange seeing this all over again, Naruto thought. His eyes were locked on Kakashi as the water prison surrounds him. Naruto couldn't help but glance at Kagami. The rabbit still wrapped in her arms makes a noise as her grip tightens. Time was up, and she had to start waking the others up. Starting with Kakashi. Naruto winced slightly, turning his gaze to the ground. Itachi might not know, and he hadn't remembered, but Naruto had seen all of Kagami, just as she had seen all of him. It was why his soul always made him feel like becoming a part of her. Basically he was. Every time she merged with a person's soul, a piece left with her. It wasn't a very big piece, but they collected until her eyes no longer hurt a person. A copy of their soul was created. Naruto and Aiko were of the few that had those copies in place. That meant they knew everything about her. And that meant her memories. And Naruto could still hear those words repeating. And he knew how much they destroyed her every time they replayed. It was going to destroy her again. Naruto couldn't help but admire Kagami. She had always been so strong. And even now, even though this will destroy her world again, she was willing to do so, for the sake of their future. He sighed silently, bringing his eyes back up to the scene before him. You wear those forehead protectors as if they really make you ninjas? You're a bunch of useless children playing ninja. A real ninja is someone who has faced death, brushed up against him, and isn't afraid to laugh in his face. Until I see you're good enough to go down in my handbook, you don't deserve the name, no, the title of ninja. Zabuza said. Sakura and Sasuke jumped when the man vanished again. Naruto brought his eyes up as he felt the man approach. A half-purple gloved hand shot out, grabbing the man's foot an inch from Naruto's face. Squeezing the foot shifted before being rendered into water, the rest of the body following along with it. Zabuza's eye widened slightly before narrowing, while Kakashi's gaze was dragged to Kagami. She had moved, standing to the side of Naruto and slightly in front of him. Naruto was standing there with a frown, his eyes moving over the area. Sasuke and Sakura had turned wide eyes to Kagami. A moment later, and the two nodded, moving to stand behind and on the other side of Tazuna again. Kakashi blinked in slight shock, the warning that had been on his lips dying at his students' expressions. Sakura's fright had vanished, and though Sasuke still trembled every few seconds, it faded. Kagami softly sit the rabbit down, shooing it away, while Naruto slowly grinned, as she stood back up. "Nay, you make death sound like such a bad thing," she muttered, tilting her head. "I can give you that most people you come across are worthless trash. However, you just threatened my future Hokage. And for that you cannot be forgiven, judgment will come. And I'm afraid she's not very kind," Kagami said slowly, and Naruto could imagine the bright smile crossing her lips. "But I think she'll go easy on you. After all, you are the challenge these brats needed," she said, ending with a sing-song voice. Zabuza's eyes narrowed at the references to judgment. It can't be. Then again, I can't see the kid's face or bangs. But what would Athena be doing with a bunch of brats? He thought, his hand clenching tighter on the prison, and thought of her. Turning her head slightly, she glanced at Naruto. "Don't you have a plan, Otouto-san?" she asked happily. Naruto's grin grew. "Why, of course, Oni-san," he said. "Hey, Sasuke, you want to help?" he asked. Sasuke blinked before a smirk spread across his face. "Of course, I'm going to be in on this. I wouldn't miss it," he declared. Sakura blinked and frowned. "Well, what about me?" she demanded. A second later she remembered the situation and blushed slightly in embarrassment. Kagami tilted her head. "Why, of course you can help Haruno. I'll take care of our client. I have something I need you particularly to do," she said in a sing-song voice. Sakura jumped at hearing Kagami talking to her. She stared at her in surprise for a few moments before smiling slightly. "All right," she said with a nod. Zabuza snorted. "What a bunch of arrogant brats," he said with a sneer. "Do you think you could possibly stand a chance?" he asked. Kakashi stared at the scene in front of him. He was proud of them, and they might stand a chance, but he couldn't let them die. He opened his mouth. "You open your mouth, bastard, and I'll sew it shut. Burn your books in front of you and desecrate their names on the stone," Kagami growled out. Kakashi stared at her with wide, shocked, disbelieving eyes. She took in his expression and snorted. "You're so proud of them normally. Let them try before you sell them short. You're as worthless as ever, if you think my Otouto will die so easily. He's going to be my Hokage-sama one day. And I won't let anyone, even you, get in his way," she stated. She shrugged. "And besides, I'll protect the client," she said with a shrug. Tazuna stared at the girl in shock at her words. So far she had been polite, even distant. To hear her say something like that, and to the leader the others follow unquestioningly. He lowered his eyes to the ground with a faint smile and sigh. "Don't worry about me," he said. Sakura and Sasuke turned back to him, while Naruto watched over his shoulder. "This is my fault, and I don't desire life so much I would make you run. So fight all you like, brats," he said with a small grin. "I'm sorry you even had to worry about me," he said. Sasuke turned with a small sound. "You hear that?" he asked Naruto, though his eyes were mainly on Kakashi. Sakura nodded, stepping up on Naruto's other side. "Looks like we got the okay from our client himself. That means it's technically in order," she said slyly, grinning at her sensei. Naruto grinned cruelly. "Let's get ready," he declared. Suddenly Zabuza started laughing. "You'll always be brats?" he muttered lowly. The three jerked their heads toward him. "So you're going to keep playing, huh? Fine. When I was about your age," he said, bringing his hands up. These hands were already dyed red with blood. He said, staring at them. Sasuke, Sakura and Tazuna's eyes widened. Naruto just lowered his head. Kakashi glanced at the man. "Devil Zabuza," he muttered. Zabuza nodded. "I see you've heard a little about it," he muttered. "Long ago, in the Hidden Mist Village, also called the Blood Mist Village, there was a final obstacle in becoming a ninja," Kakashi said, lowly, catching the Genin's and Tazuna's attention. Zabuza turned to him. "Oh, you also know about that graduation exam?" he asked. Sakura frowned. "What exam?" she asked. Zabuza started laughing again. "Hey, what exam?" Sasuke asked a moment later. Zabuza continued laughing. "Fights to the death between the students." Zabuza stopped laughing with a jerk. Everyone's head snapped once more to Kagami, whose hand was rested on her mask. "Academy students. The ones you trained with, grew up with, ate with, even called friends. They were ultimately pitted against each other. They were to fight until the others were slaughtered, until there was a victor." The final test was to kill those that had become close. To prove that you could kill when needed, that the only thing you were loyal to was the village and the Mizukje. That was the graduation exam 10 years ago. Kagami started trailing off for a moment. They changed it 10 years ago because the previous year, something unexpected happened, she explained. Unexpected? Sakura asked. A devil appeared. This devil, this boy, wasn't even a ninja, and without pause or hesitation, he slaughtered over 100 of the students. And because of this he gained the name, Devil Zabuza. Kagami said, her mask flicking to his direction. After that they couldn't truth another student to not do the same. And as such it was cancelled. However, they still held final fights. It was no longer among a group of students. Merely one-on-one. That way if one died it wasn't that big of a loss, she said, shrugging her shoulders and looking off. Zabuza stared at her, eyes narrowed. You seem to know quite a bit about mist, he muttered. Naruto grinned up at him. That's because Oni-san used to be a mist shinobi, he said with a chuckle. Sasuke and Sakura jerked their head in her direction. Kagami tilted her head in a thinking position. I graduated 11 years ago, 2 years after your massacre, devil, she said slowly. Zabuza's eyes narrowed. Is that right? He asked before vanishing. Kagami moved to the side, pulling Tazuna with her. Sasuke and Naruto gasped in surprise. Zabuza elbowed Sasuke out of the way, then brought his arm down hard, slamming Sasuke into the ground. He coughed, blood spraying. Sakura's eyes widened. Sasuke-kun, she called. Kakashi stared at the sight in horror. Zabuza looked down at the brat stepping on his throat. Die, he declared. Sasuke grunted before smirking. Suddenly he imploded into a black substance that was sticky and clung to the missing nin. Success, Sakura declared, as she brought her hands up. Kai, she called. Sasuke and Naruto appeared, a moment later. Sasuke smirked in the air. Evil wind shrunken. Shadow windmill, he called, throwing it toward the clone. Zabuza, clone snorted, grabbing his sword. Even now that won't work on me, he declared. However, it moved right past him. Sakura brought her hands into the tiger seal. Ignite, she called. Suddenly the black substance became a burning acid, which destroyed the clone. I see, you're aiming for the real me and not my clone. It's still not enough, he called out, grabbing the shrunken. Another one appeared directly below it. One in its shadow? He asked. It went flying toward his face, but he jumped over it. Still not enough, he called. Sasuke smirked while Sakura grinned again, her hands repeating the process. Ignite, she called. Sasuke tossed a kunai in the air. Before placing his hands in the ram sign, Zabuza's eyes widened and he tossed the blade away. The blade exploded into the substance again, clinging to his hand and arm, once again becoming a burning acid. A poof of smoke from the second shrunken Naruto appeared. He grinned and tossed a kunai in the air, making the ram symbol. Another poof and Sasuke appeared, hand at his mouth. Fire release, he called. Zabuza jerked his head around with wide eyes. Great fireball. The fireball flew towards Zabuza, who jumped away as fast as he could, his hand releasing the prison. Ninja wire shot out, wrapping around Sasuke's wrist and jerking him back toward dry land where the other two stood pulling him. Zabuza held his hand for a second before grabbing his sword and dashing toward the three. Damned brats, he thought in rage. The three looked up and he brought his sword down to meet the plate on Kakashi's glove. Kakashi glared at him before turning toward the three. Great plan, you guys really have grown up. You too, Sakura? He said with an eye smile. Naruto grinned at him, pulling Sasuke from the water, while Sasuke smirked, and Sakura blushed slightly under the praise. Zabuza closed his eyes. Hey, I got distracted and released the prison, he muttered. Wrong, Kakashi stated. You were forced to release it. Not bad for a bunch of kids playing ninja, huh? He asked. I don't fall for the same thing twice. What will you do now? Zabuza snorted. Bah, he hissed and jumped back, Kakashi coping him. Kagami sighed, grabbing Tazuna. How annoying, she muttered. Reaching out and grabbing Sakura's hair, she jumped back into the trees, Sasuke and Naruto coping her. They all landed, Sakura rubbing her head for a moment before her eyes locked onto the two men below. I can't keep up, she thought. Sasuke doing the same and watching them in awe, he thought in slight shock. Is this what it means to be a Junin? He muttered lowly. Naruto stood on his branch watching all of it. Kagami grunted, pushing Tazuna behind her. Brace yourselves, she muttered, before the water exploded everywhere. Zabuza slammed into the tree with kunai sticking from him with a grunt of pain. Kakashi crouched on the tree branch, kunai in hand. It's over, he stated. Zabuza jerked his eyes wildly up to him. How? Can you see the future? He asked jerkily. Kakashi brought the blade up. Yay, and you're going to die, he called, preparing to attack. Suddenly 2 needles shot through the air, pricing the man's neck. Everyone's eyes widened. Sakura, Sasuke, and Kakashi all jerked their heads toward Kagami's spot, only to find her mask on the ground with a slight crack. She was drenched in water and crouched over. Tazuna was on his knees behind her. You're right, he's dead, a voice called cheerfully. They all looked up to see a person with a mask similar to Kagami's. The only difference was the symbol and markings on it. Kakashi's eyes narrowed slightly and he reappeared beside Zabuza, checking his pulse. He really is dead, he thought in confusion. Thank you very much, the figure said, bowing their head. I had been searching for Momochi Zabuza for quite some time. It would seem he kept slipping from my grasp, he stated calmly. As such, I had been unable to find an opportunity to kill him. Kakashi glanced over at him. That mask, you're a hidden mist hunter nin, right? Kakashi asked, his gaze wandering over to his students. Correct. I am a member of the Hidden Mists Hunter Nin team. I'm impressed you knew what I was. Sakura and Sasuke were watching the scene in confusion. However, they seemed fine. It would appear Kagami's interference had stopped them from getting hit with the water explosion. Naruto was staring at the Hunter Nin in suspicion, while he helped Tazuna up. Kagami was still crouched over for some reason. A shift of her fingers caught her attention. She was tapping them lightly as she did when lost in thought. At least that destroyed his theories of her being hurt. His gaze drifted back to the Hunter Nin. From his voice and height, he's probably around Kagami's age. And he's already a Hunter Nin. I guess I can't be that surprised. I know Kagami's a Junin at least. And she's still hiding her main skills. Now that I think about it, I have to wonder about Naruto as well, he thought with a frown as he finally stood. I don't understand, Kakashi-sensei, Sakura said as Kakashi came closer. That boy's around our age and he took down such a strong man. How is that possible? She asked, slightly scared and confused. She knew what a Hunter Nin was, and it was hard to imagine a kid around their age being one. Kakashi sighed, looking down on her. I know it's a bit unreal, but here's a truth in the world, he said, resting his hand on her head. In this world, there exists kids younger than you, yet stronger than me, he said, ruffling her hair. Not by much because they would lack experience, but still, he thought, turning his gaze to his other students. Sasuke was watching the boy with a serious expression. Naruto, however, had closed his eyes and was picking up Kagami's mask. A shift later revealed the Hunter Nin crouched by Zabuza. Your battle is finished now, he said, lifting Zabuza to his shoulder. And now I must dispose of the body, since it seems to be one with many secrets, he said, making a symbol. Farewell, he said, vanishing. Kakashi reached up and pulled his headband down, only to blink, realizing it wasn't on his forehead any longer. Blinking, he looked down to see Kagami wrapping his headband around her eyes. She paused for a moment, tilting her head in his direction. What? My mask cracked and my eyes are more important than yours, you pathetic Junin, she said with a shrug and a slight snort. Kakashi closed both eyes with a sigh. Why must she be such a pain? He wondered, feeling his eye twitch. Turning to the other, he smiled, opening his normal eye. Okay, then we have to get Tazuna safely home. Let's move out, he said. Tazuna laughed, pulling his hat back. Super thanks to you lot. When you get to my house you can relax for a bit, he declared with a grin. Tazuna, Sakura, and Sasuke all looked over when they heard the thud. Kakashi-sensei? Sasuke asked hesitantly. What's wrong? Sakura demanded in worry. Naruto brought Kagami's mask up to his face to hide his laughter. Kakashi lay silently on the ground, watching their reactions. My body, I can't move it. I must have used the Sharingan too much, he thought. A snort was heard. You'll never change, Hitaki. The voice sounded like Kagami's, but it also sounded older, more mature. Kakashi blinked in confusion, opening both eyes and moved them toward the voice. Mirror-like orbs reflected back at him, his headband directly beneath them. His eyes widened at the sudden pressure he felt in his mind, no his soul, and suddenly, The world exploded into white agonizing pain. "So you're Hitaki?" Kakashi looked up blinking in confusion. Before him stood a female. Silver bangs framed her face, while the rest was black and pulled into a high tail. Her skin was translucent, almost onion-like in his opinion. Her eyes were covered with a purple strap of material. However, what caught his attention was the Akatsuki cloak she wore. The ring she wore was silver instead of red, while her nail polish was a silver purple. He could see purple, almost slash-like marks disappear beneath that cloth. A blood-red slash lay on either side of her mouth from chin, acid green outlining them. There was something malice-filled about her, cold and detached. "Well, my father was also Hitaki, perhaps you mean him?" he wondered. It had been a while since the remainders of Akatsuki had joined them against Madara and Sasuke. A snort was heard and the lips pulled into an amused smirk. "How cute. You're as annoying as you are pathetic," she said. Kakashi blinked and looked up only to feel like his body had been broken in half. Her hand tightened on his shoulder, while her fist lay in his gut. "I don't take kindly to people who favor one over another. I expect you to give Naruto some real training. And I don't mean the bullshit you've passed off for it." That voice hissed from beside his ear. The fist jerked back and the hand tightened. He understood this, but he couldn't accept her role. Kana's role was to judge, to purify, to damn, to decide what became of them. And unlike the others, she honestly didn't care. Aiko loved to hunt to understand the enemy. And Naruto, though he hated it, loved violence and bloodshed. But her, she didn't even care about the souls she judged. She did so to get it over with. She looked at their bad deeds and ignored the good. "I can never forgive her," he swore. She was kinder to those Naruto loved, he could admit that. She sent them off with a certain grace. It almost seemed mournful. If only he didn't know it was all an illusion for Naruto's sake. She burned their bodies. It was supposed to cleanse them in all ways. She could only purify their souls. Burning them erased all sins and made sure in the afterlife they were born anew sinless. His eyes drifted following her as she carefully set the coins to their rest. She didn't caress the faces. No, she merely rested her hand on their foreheads, those damned eyes lowered. Almost as if sad or emotional. The tapping fingers proved her to be thinking, plotting. Yet she didn't love Naruto so much he would warn him. But there was one thing he would admit for her. She would never abandon a true ally. Which was more than he could say for a lot of people lately. And to her, anyone Naruto thought of as a friend was an ally. Well, except for himself. Then again, the only thing they thought of each other was the most painful way to kill the other. He watched the scene in disgust. Was this what Naruto had become? The happy-go-lucky knuckle-headed most unpredictable ninja? Had he truly become, like her? A river of blood flow around his once student. A malice-filled yet satisfied grin on his features. His tongue flicking out the lap at the blood trailing down his face. The worst part was that there wasn't a flicker of red in his eyes. She came up to him giggling and dancing as she always did during a massacre. Her hand coming up to caress his face, cleanse it of the blood. She would then pull him in her arms like a moth would and cuddle him. Caressing his hair and cooing in his ear. Instead of words of comfort, she promised death and destruction, torture and vindication. And he had to stop the bile in his throat every time he would turn in her arms, cuddling her and laughing so cheerfully. Just like he used to. And it was enough to almost distract him from their comrades that lay around them. But he still caught the black gaze that fell on the resurrected blonde bomber. And he knew he imagined that flicker of emotion. After all, what would a monster need feeling for? And she is a monster, she corrupts all she touches. And he doesn't understand, she has the same power Naruto has. The power to make others believe in her. Care for her, love her even. It's almost as if they become blinded by her faults and she her non-existent good side. Sure, some of the things she's done can be seen as good deeds. But she told him herself. She doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. Good or evil. She only understands intent and consequence. And he watches everyone willing to die for her. Aiko follows her like a guard dog starved for attention. Tsunade-sama respects her and gives her control of their forces more often than not. And Gaara is almost fanatical about her, even going so far as to claim her, his personal guard and advisor. And Shikamaru believes her when she tells him of the happy reunion of Kurenai, and allows her to hide the child away. And Sai acts like her personal bodyguard, even going so far as to speak for her and take anger in her place. And Iruka treats her like one would a child for some reason, as if she's his little girl or baby sister. And Madara is so obsessed with having her on his side he would hand over Sasuke and Kabuto for her. And Naruto hangs onto her every world like a faithful student. And a part of him is jealous. And he can only blame himself. There was a time Naruto would have followed him around as such. However, his mind had been filled with regret, and redemption, and the council's orders. And by the time he realized Naruto was indeed going to change the world, she had already sunken her claws into him. And he'll never forgive her for changing him, for making him into this bloodthirsty man, for teaching him in a way that had her believing in him, for succeeding where he failed, on so many levels and so many times. But mostly he hates her because she affects everyone she comes in contact with. And I hate that I can't stop this attraction, these cursed feelings. He's more disgusted with her weakness than her cruelty. Every time she comes across that man she almost resembles little more than a puppet. It's so pathetic that even now Madara holds so much control over her. She can barely control herself when he gives her an order. Her body automatically going to fulfill his wish. It's only luck that she stops herself. But then she's a statue until he's pushed away from her. A liability. But mainly he knew the reason he hated seeing her vulnerable. Iruka consoles her over tea, moving her hair from her face and gently whipping the blood away. Aiko stands guard when she closes her eyes, trying to find herself in the twisting conscious of all the souls she's come in contact with. Naruto will cling to her until there are no more trembles left. Tsunade smiles at her, reaching up and grabbing the jewel with the Suna emblem, bringing Kana's own hands up to grasp it, and she does with trembling hands. And Shikamaru will sit back to back with her and hand her one of those cigarettes he always carries. And though he'll never admit it, he knows why he is so disgusted with these scenes. I'll never be able to comfort her like she needs. And by the time he's finally able to do something about it, finally willing to confess, it's too late. She looked so shocked. Wide reflective eyes staring into mix-matched red and black. He wondered if she looked like this when Sai took the hit that killed him. He supposed he could understand why everyone gave her space after that. He didn't like that look in her eyes. Kagami wasn't one to be scared of anything. And yet fear, confusion, and shock were all he could find. The three things she never felt. He knew he was dying. The blood was draining from him. And their eyes stayed locked even as she finished off the enemies. Her abilities were great. It made him grateful that he never had to face her other than their spats and arguments. She never actually tried to kill him. He could see that now, otherwise he would have died when they met. It was odd to see the shift. Just a moment ago she was teasing him about losing his mask. While they didn't get along, they were at least civil now. For Tsunade's sake, for Aiko's sake, for Naruto's sake, for his own sake, because he can't stand hating her, not anymore. Sometimes he wonders, what would it have been like if things had been different? What if she had been on the team? Would they still hate one another? Would she still call him a fool, worthless, pathetic gray-haired bastard? Would she still chose Suna as her true village? Would she still chose to follow Gaara, even to his death? Would he still repeat his actions, his consequences? He doesn't know, and he jokingly asks her these questions as he confesses all of his shortcomings, his regrets, his mistakes, his hope for redemption. But never his true feeling. He wants that to be the last. He wants to see her reaction. That way, if it truly is hatred she feels, it won't hurt. After all, death would be next. There would be no more regrets of what could have, what should have been. And so he merely talks. And as he feels everything fades, he finally asks a request. Naruto needs someone to stand by his side. And he knows she would never leave him, but he wants a promise. And once she does, he finally tells his truth. The anguish in her expression is a shock. And he feels his final regret. He never wanted that to be on her face. Not because of him. That expression came with Madara and her mother. He wanted her uncaring indifference. Not that pain and suffering. But it also causes a smile to spread across his lips. So it wasn't hatred after all. Ma, what fools we are. He thinks. As the darkness takes hold, he can only have one thing he didn't regret. He proved he wasn't a coward. And though it was also his final regret seeing the anguish shine through those blank eyes, the cause allows it to be his final triumph. I love you, Kagami? The darkness resides. You're awake? His eyes slowly open, and they lock on a ceiling he remembers fuzzily from so long ago. but they shift onto a face he's seen moments before. In two different memories. His mind makes an image of both of them. And despite the age difference, they are the same. Even down to that anguish expression and raw emotions buried behind. Even now he can see that expression and emotion hidden deeply beneath her normal indifferent cold facade. His lips part and a chalked laugh escapes. "I guess I get to find out after all," he muttered, referring to his not-so-foolish questions of Kadbi's. And those eyes. Those precious and cursed, but oh-so-dear eyes flash in a combination of relief, amusement, anguish, and hesitancy. Perhaps. Though having a worthless bastard, like you Hitaki, as a sensei has been obsolete. She muttered, those eyes closing as the fingers tap on the floor. His gaze shifts to the doorway and he can see Naruto leaning against it. His eyes away from them, and he knows Naruto knows his confessions. "Well, I'll apologize for that later," he said, pushing himself up to sit. His arms rest on his blanket-covered legs and his gaze locks on hers. And he can feel how intensely he's watching her. The heat of his gaze causing her to stiffen. Those eyes filled now with an animalistic need to escape. "I'll go inform Tsunami you are awake," she mutters, head bowed as she tries to make a hasty retreat. Naruto hits his forehead and gives him a look. Kakashi sighs, and his wrist shoots out. Kagami takes a moment to register what happened. And she hates him more now than ever before. Even if her heart feels oh so wonderfully heavy and she feels the need to doze off suddenly. She's filled with the scent of electricity, or more correctly lightning, a hint of dog, sweat, blood, and something like sandalwood. Kakashi's arms wrap tighter around her, locking her in place. His nose nuzzles her hair lightly. She smells the same. She smells of something cold yet dark, a sharp sting of something like winter, steel or metal, blood, and overall something sweet and consuming. Addicting. He sighs. "We need to talk." Kakashi stared with blank eyes at the group. Sakura kept jumping and looking around her with a wide look in her eyes. Tsunami had told him he heard her asking Kagami for training help, saying she wanted to be useful. And since Kagami was already training Hinata and had helped Ino Pig, it sounded like a good idea. That, and she really wanted to earn Kagami's respect. He can guess how that went, seeing as Sakura was covered in bandages and her hair was singed and cut in places. Naruto was caught between laughing every time he saw Kakashi's bruised face, wincing every time he looked at Kagami, shaking his head every time Sasuke would arch a brow at him, and trying to inch away from Kagami's choke hold. Kagami had her arms wrapped around Naruto's neck, keeping him in front of her. She was never more than 2 steps away from him at most. She allowed her gaze to drift over the area. However, it seemed each person gained a different look. Sakura gained a satisfied glance. Sasuke an indifferent one. Naruto a threatening one, while Kakashi gained a blank glare. Sasuke was looking between the others on the team. He seemed to be lost on how to react. Sakura paranoia was making him paranoid. Naruto was insane or had multiple personalities. And Kagami was oddly enough using Naruto as a shield between Kakashi and her. Kakashi couldn't help but let his head drop. He just knew this was going to be hell. Again, Sakura panted harshly as she tried to dodge the attacks heading in her direction. She made sure to ignore the wounds she gained. She didn't allow herself to wince when she was stabbed. Her feet were blistered and bleeding. Her hair had been pulled back in a braid. The pieces that had escaped had already been sliced off. Her clothes were in tatters. She had already cut off the flaps of her dress as they interfered. Blood poured endlessly from her. The ground soaked in splashes and weapons. Stage 2. She took a breath looking up. She ducked under the fire jutsu. She could feel it singing the end of her hair. The water jutsu was also evaded but caused her to slip slightly. She jumped back from the earth spikes. The wind attack slicing at her stomach, causing her to jump back again. Her feet landed in the water and her world lit up in agony. The lightning attack ran through her, the ground helping it with the water. Stage 3. She gasped, pushing it aside and bringing her hands up for the genjutsu seals she had been taught. A few moments passed without attacks as she crept toward the target. However, within moments more shrunken were aiming toward her, causing her to duck. Stage 4. Giving a battle cry, Sakura rushed toward the target. All of her attacks were evaded. Punches turned away, kicking ducked or jumped over. Kunai were jerked from her hands as the target moved around her. It was almost like a dance. Her opponent the graceful master and she the clumsy beginner. Stage 5. Her eyes widened. Suddenly there was pain in her stomach. It made her feel like a steel slab had gone straight through her. That same force met with her chin, dislocating it easily. Next, her arm was grabbed and easily broken. With that same arm she flipped and swung into the trees. She crashed through 6 or 7 before smacking into one harshly. A second later her hair was grabbed and her face smashed into said tree, causing it to break. The next thing she knew was darkness. Kagami paused, blinking down at the sprawled and unconscious form of her temporary student. She reached up, scratching the back of her head. "Maybe I should have lessened my strength more than I thought," she muttered, crossing her arms and tilting her head, Naruto's headband over her eyes. Naruto winced from his spot in the tree. "Now I remember the reason I never got on Athena's bad side. Or asked for training," he thought, "but usually she can control her strength better. Man, she must be really affected by Kakashi," he thought with a frown. Kagami just sat there frozen. Time seemed to have frozen for a moment. She wanted to get away, had to. But she couldn't remember why anymore. She was so comfortable here, so warm and safe. She hadn't felt that since her mother. Her eyes drifted closed for a moment and she relaxed. The arms tightening and the face burrowing into her hair. Why did she want to leave again? She couldn't remember. Suddenly there were footsteps. "Is Kakashi-sensei awake yet?" Tsunami's voice was heard from the doorway. Her eyes shot open. Within a matter of minutes, senbon were stabbed through Kakashi's muscles, making his arms useless. At the same time, Kagami finally lost her legendary control. She vanished as the door opened. The group, minus Naruto, who was laughing while holding his head, was staring at Kakashi in shock. Mainly the needles sticking from him and the bright red handmark on his face. Naruto couldn't help but chuckle again and lean back in his tree. "I can't remember Kagami ever slapping someone before," he thought in amusement. "Wait till the guys and Aiko hear about this." He snickered. He could still hear Kagami muttering as she walked past him. "I feel violated?" This set him off to laughing again. That is until the weapons were heading in his direction and Kagami was laughing insanely. Aiko smiled slightly to Konan as she handed her the tea. Taking it with both hands, she blew the steam from it softly. Konan sat on the edge of her bed. Kimimaro leaned against the wall near her head. Pain sat in a chair nearby. And Itachi stood by the window. Deidara was glaring at Kisame from his seat. Kisame would twitch and whine every few seconds from his bed. Sasori was going over a scroll for some puppet modifications Kagami had sent. Kakuzu and Hidan were on a mission and Zetsu was somewhere. "Good news is you're all back to normal. Although I will ask you to take it easy for the next few days," she said as she glanced over the clipboard in her hand. Aiko nodded softly, her eyes traveling out to the rainless window. She looking back at Pain with a slight frown. "Why are you in such a good mood?" she asked in confusion. A smirk spreads across the normally stern features. "I just received a little letter from our little fox," he said slowly. Aiko arched a brow in confusion. "Oh?" she asked. The smirk grew. "Concerning our judge?" He trailed off. The room's attention shifted to him immediately. It was hard to get anything on Athena. And that smirk was Pain's blackmail smirk. He held up a message packet. "A few pictures concerning our judge and a gray-haired sensei." He trailed off. Slowly the smirk spread across Aiko's and Itachi's faces. Within moments the scene at Tsunami's was being viewed by the members of Akatsuki. However, "I'll kill that bastard for touching my little Kira," a certain blonde screamed. A second later an explosion occurred. "Deidara, you're such a hypocrite," Sakura finally screamed. She sat on her hands and knees, face toward the ground as trees fell down her face in pain. "How so?" Kagami asked, entangling the strands of pink hair from her fingers. "You're always complaining about my hair. It's too long and easy to grab. Yours is twice as long as mine. And it's even softer," she hissed in annoyance. Kagami paused. "Does it really bother you?" she asked, pulling her braid over her shoulder. Sakura looked up with a glare. "Yes," she hissed. "I don't see you cutting your hair," she said in annoyance. Kagami hummed slightly. "I see," she muttered. Reaching inside her sash, she pulled out an odd blue tanto. Sakura looked up, blinking at it as Kagami walked over to her. Reaching down, she grabbed Sakura's hair, tilting her head in thought, before dropping it. Sakura looked up again in confusion and opened her mouth only to freeze in shock. The black strands floated slowly to land on the forest ground. Kagami placed the tanto and ring that held her hair into her sash. Reaching back, she pulled her hair over her shoulder and looked over it. Tossing it back, she placed her hands on her hips. There, it's the same length as yours, so quite complaining and stand up. I'm not finished with you, she said, turning her back on the girl. Sakura merely stared down at the strands in shock. Is this what being a ninja means? Not caring about your appearance? So cut her hair without a second thought. Would I be willing to do that? Could I handle cutting my hair if I had a reason? I grew it out because someone said Sasuke-kun liked long hair, but so far it seems like he doesn't care about looks either, Sakura paused and a sad smile crossed her lips. She makes me seem like such a child, she thought, clenching her fists. I am a disgrace, aren't I? She wondered. I don't understand what the whole thing about my hair was, but I did as you asked. Kagami muttered as she wrapped the end off with some spare bandages. Naruto shrugged. Meh, it seemed to have a big impact on Sakura the first time around. Hopefully with this she'll grow up faster. Even after she started taking things seriously, she acted like a little girl. He muttered, his mind filled with a tear-filled begging Sakura. And I can't allow myself to make that promise again, he muttered. Kakashi sighed, shutting his book. True, that promise kept you from killing him several times. It would be best if it was never asked. He agreed. Kagami had finally agreed to be near him. As long as he promised to hold off any talks until they returned to Kahona, handed in their reports, and had no other missions and arrangements. He had a feeling he would have to personally ask for a day off, and even then she'll try and sneak away. Kagami merely hummed, throwing her hair over her shoulder. I never cared much for long hair, but Deidara will probably ask me to regrow it. After all, you want me to cut at the exams as well, right? She asked. Naruto nodded. Sakura respects you. If you cut your hair after that team fights us and everything, it will be seen as a symbol of respect from you, he said. Kagami shrugged, crossing her arms. Whatever, I guess I can deal with that, she said. Kakashi sighed. Manipulating your teammates so professionally. You grew up so fast, Kakashi exclaimed, wiping away a fake tear. Naruto just grinned at him. Well, I did learn from the best, didn't I? He asked cheekily. Yay, Jiraiya-sama really knew his stuff. Kagami snorted. Kakashi flinched from the remark and Naruto sighed, standing. Cut it out. I'm going to prepare things for meeting Haku in the morning. You make sure you talk to Zabuza, he said, nodding to her. Kagami sighed. Yay, yay. The whole reason I made a contract with that weirdo, at least he's not the worst. He could still do with a shirt though. And Kisame has been asking when I'll send the guy, she muttered with a slight huff. Naruto nodded. Good. Then Kakashi will train Sasuke and Sakura tomorrow. Kagami will claim to be giving her a break for the next few days to think things over. Things are going smoothly so far, he said, turning to leave. Oh, and Kakashi, Itachi also wants to have a chat with you when we return, he said, looking at him over his shoulder. Kakashi winced. Man, you're all going to cut me down, aren't you? Wasn't I better this time around? He asked. Naruto nodded with a grin. Yes, you have been. That's why Ida-kun hasn't tortured you yet, he said cheerfully. Kakashi sighed, dropping his head in depression. He paused and frowned. Wait a minute? Suddenly his eye twitched and he looked up to the two in resignation. Itachi's kitsune, isn't he? Naruto's grin answered that question. Kagami arched a brow. Ida-kun? She asked, slyly looking at Naruto with mysterious expression. A blush stained whiskered cheeks as he defended himself, leaving the room. The two left snickered at the sight before turning to each other. Glares were exchanged before they finally turned away. Finally Kakashi stood and made his way to the doorway. However, Kagami beat him, pushing him aside. Ladies first, she said snidely. That's fine, tell me when one comes by. I see no lady here, he declared with a bored glance. Kagami's eye twitched and she grabbed his crutch, kicking him in the knee. The sound of it dislocating gave her a twisted smirk of please. She turned and walked away, whistling and twirling the crutch like a baton. Kakashi's shouts, curses and complaints were music to her ears. The clearing was peaceful. The sunlight lit the place up in a bright, dreamlike state. The birds flocked around the area, mainly after the berries in the tree. Another reason they were here was that the human that rested in the clearing had no malice whatsoever. They knew they were safe with him, just as they were with the soft boy who came. They trusted these boys to not damage the place, and so were fond of them. They kind of liked the mirror girl as well, but she was always filled with such hatred and pain that they couldn't get near her without being overwhelmed. One of the birds flew down, landing lightly on the boy's chest and watching him in concerned eyes. He looked worn down. Naruto lay there with closed eyes. Outfit dirtied and slightly torn, arms and legs sprawled out. It was times like this that he was thankful to Aiko and Kagami for warning him about training. If he had pushed past his limits and tried to gain the level he had been, well, it would have been harder to hide his skill, and he knew he would become extremely bored. At least now he could still train without causing too much destruction or gaining a lot of attention. And seeing that for this life he didn't want as much attention as before, he tried to be careful. In his mind he flipped through his memories and the ones that weren't his own. He had merged his mind with Kagami. It was an option, however she rarely granted it. So far only he and Aiko had the connection. She was thinking of others that she might do so with. It would all depend really. When you merged with Kagami, you merged with her mind and her memories. She once said that merging with others helped her keep in mind who she was. Which were her memories, her emotions, her thoughts, and not the ones of the several souls she contained. Because the only mind other than your own you could see was hers. You couldn't see any of the others. The only memories you didn't gain were when she was soul diving. They were blocked out, helping with the separation. When the gods were granted their titles and powers, they would be separated into groups, and the leader would be who she merged with. And even then they would have to suffer still to even get to that level. It was a good thing they were waking everyone up by the end of the invasion. That way she should be able to merge with them once they returned with Jiraiya. Sighing silently, he shut off his thoughts and took in the sound of nature around him. He had been tense since he joined the team. Seeing those two again was horrible. Remembering the trust and teamwork he had with them was even worse. Sometimes he wanted to get rid of them. Other times he wanted to cry and scream and shout at them that he would never forgive them. And yet the last part wanted to lock them away where they would be safe and the real world wouldn't taint them. Decisions? The soft chirping of new birds joining him brought the presence to mind. Hey, if you sleep here you'll catch a cold. The gentle voice said as soft but firm hands shook his shoulders. Haku, who the hell are you, brat? Zabuza hissed, staring at the broken mask covering the girl's face. He remembered her. She was the one from Kiri on that Kahona team. You still act like an annoying old windbag? Zabuza hissed, his eyes narrowing and the blade flashing through the air. A few strands of black float through the air as she dodges at the last moment. Zabuza sits there in his slumped position, panting and glaring. However, suddenly he frowns, staring at the mask, mainly the strand of silver spilling over it. A chuckle bubbles up and then he's laughing as he flops back. I take it it's time to join your service, Athena-sama? He asked with a grin. The mask was removed delicately and placed in her sash. Kisame has been biting my head off about not having you join yet. She muttered with a faint hint of annoyance. Zabuza blinks in slight shock before his face softens. I see you did indeed gain some emotions, at least enough to feel something. He muttered as he moved to sit leaning against the headboard wall. Those eyes stay averted. Despite all their meetings, Zabuza still cannot look in them without having his mind, soul ripped apart. Hi, the blonde is Ares. He's been helping me gain a childhood. Until I passed the genin exams anyway. She said with a shrug. Zabuza shrugs. He keeps in mind who Ares is though. Both Athena and Artemis spoke highly of their brother. Suddenly he grinned again. Kisame, huh? He asks and closes his eyes for a moment to gain his bearings and prepare himself. He hears her nod and breathes through his nose. A sigh and he opens his eyes, locking on Silver. The pain is immediate. Aiko breathes in deeply with her eyes closed as she concentrates. It would seem things were going fine so far. She felt pain for her master having to awaken Kakashi. However, she knew that he would be the one to heal her. To make her whole, so while she sympathized, she couldn't say she regretted her master's pain. And if Kagami had refused, she would have forced her to awaken him somehow. Kakashi was a valuable player and was needed. As both a god and Kagami's other half. Their relationship was odd and she had a feeling it always would be. They would always hate each other just as much as they loved one another. One could say it was obsession and possession that would keep them together. However, Aiko knew the raw emotion they had felt for one another. The strength of their hate alone was enough proof. You couldn't hate someone that much or deeply without a deeper emotion backing it up. A smile spread across her face. A reason there was no doubt Sasuke would fight for vengeance in Itachi's name once he found the truth. He always did love his brother. Same as Itachi had planned to die for the damned brat. At least they wouldn't be repeating that mistake again. She had wondered about telling Sasuke the truth. But Orochimaru needed to die. And to do that he needed to merge with Sasuke again, so he could be sealed. Kagami had refused to purify or even touch his soul. And his was too slippery to kill or see completely destroyed, so they would have to seal it again. And it would be best to get Kabuto out of the way fast. He would become annoying. And while Kagami could purify or banish any souls, reanimated bodied were her weakness. She could destroy them, yes, but she feared them. And it wasn't a surprise. Her entire being was created around and connected to the souls of the world, and afterlife if she opened the connection. A body without a soul was her weakness because it simply shouldn't exist. Her bloodline said that, and as such her body froze. Her bloodline wouldn't let her fight against that which shouldn't exist. It also wouldn't allow her to be tainted from them. It had taken a lot of years for her to even be able to move against her bloodline's lockdown. And it was only by luck that her special attacks needed her will and power, not hand signs or body movement. Still, it had taken that long to free her mind from the lockdown as well. She said her thoughts became nothing more than a frenzy of fear and panic. She couldn't allow her master to go through that again. It was amusing, really. Kagami was terrified of few things, reanimated corpses being one because they were abominations. She could handle and accept Pain's forms because it was his soul filling them and as such not an abomination. Naruto was afraid of ghosts. And Aiko couldn't stand torture. Being tortured or seeing it. What a group they made, huh? Aiko's eyes fluttered open at the hand on her forehead. She smiled up at Kimimaro and gained one in return. Standing, she stretched and smiled. Let's get a mission, she declared, walking toward the door. Kimimaro nodded, following after her. Hiruzen sighed heavily as he removed the pipe from his mouth. His gaze drifted over to the cage Bunshin helping with his paperwork. While he himself could only do one, it would seem Kagami and Naruto didn't have that problem. Turns out the girl was a powerhouse just like Naruto. Though that wasn't surprising seeing as she had a bloodline that never deactivated. Kagami's had transformed with Naruto's jutsu, well, a male version. In place was a pale male with light purple eyes. Silver short bangs that fell above her eyes and framed the sides of her face to her chin. The rest was black and pulled in a tail at the nape of his neck ending at his waist. He was a skinny thing like her, but muscular underneath the soft deceptive skin. He was feminine like Naruto, but neither of them could be confused for a girl. Maybe they wore clothing. Kagami's Bunshin was dressed in the same uniform as Ibiki, seeing as Kagami was his apprentice. No one knew who his apprentice was, so they kept up the illusion that this male, Mamoru, was it. That way they could get away with her still being on Team 7, while Mamoru was with Ibiki. After all, they were still covering up her skill. It wouldn't do well for a rookie genin to already be the head of poison and drug creation, usage, distribution, and counter. Not to mention Ibiki already gave him unsupervised sessions. People were already paranoid about Inochi's daughter becoming Anko's new plaything. They started drinking or running when they realized that instead she was becoming a mini version of the snake bitch. But it seemed to be doing her good. At least the emotional and mental torture didn't affect her as easily. Mamoru was going through the classified files and council work. So far he had found at least 6 hidden missions. And 4 orders that had been disguised. Naruto was working on the less important stuff. Mainly mission paperwork and mission reports for D class through low A class. His gaze once more drifted out the window and a smile crossed his lips. Now that he knew his time was limited, he was really taking the time to appreciate things. He turned his gaze back down and buried his nose in the orange book, giggling. He had never allowed himself to participate in such unclothed behavior as perversion. But he must say his student was a genius. Now all he had to do was find Jiraiya's original book somewhere and his life would be complete. After all, he had to know the story of the character Naruto was named after. That and a nice peaceful day with his family and a promise that Konohamaru would sign the summoning scroll when he became a genin. Nagato moved his arms slowly. He was working on gaining muscle in them with a program Conan designed. He would do vigorous training, but slowly so he could feel the burn. He almost regretted telling her the truth. She had become a true slave master since then. It was so different from the passive-aggressive person she had been in both his future self's memories and his present selves. Although it might have to do with her moving on, she had suddenly declared she was tired of waiting and was moving on one day. It had been after another of her weird teasing sessions about Naruto. He was still confused at what she meant. She said she would still be by his side and love him though, but she would step aside for the champion. Conan was confusing him more than often lately. Itachi had seemed as confused at him but amused at the same time. Then again she had been acting weird around him as well. If he didn't know any better he would think Conan had regained her memories as well. But she hadn't had them awakened and she had personally told him she didn't remember any of it. So he didn't have much of a clue. Not that he had had much time to think lately. What with Deidara once again destroying the main building, he could only sigh in relief knowing that those bouts of anger would end soon. At least when it came to his buildings, he knew Deidara would always be temperamental and violent. That's just who he was. Truthfully, everyone was counting down the day till Sasori snapped and finally jumped him just to tire him out. The tension between them could be nothing and most of the members of Akatsuki had admitted it. Although there were also bets that Deidara would do the jumping when he was in a particularly bad mood. The first time around Nagato hadn't really paid attention to that, so he couldn't say for sure how it would happen. Between those two no one could really tell who would jump who. Although the theories and plots were growing day by the day and they seemed to be the only ones oblivious to it. His mind flashed back to the time travelers. Athena was finally becoming a human. Naruto had finally accepted himself as a bringer of war and no longer felt remorse. Aiko was finally gaining a life of her own, no longer waiting on Kagami hand and foot. They were coming along great. And he would be the first to admit that he didn't mind following them. He had realized this the first time he had met Athena originally. There was something about her that made even Madara seem insignificant, and once the others had reached their roles, they had gained that same presence. Although Athena would always continue to be their leader. After all, a soul was the most valuable thing to a human. And with her abilities and the fact that she was the judge, most would see her as what she was. The ultimate judgment. And she would always follow Naruto because he broke her from the control she had fallen under. Just as she would always confide in Aiko for being at her side no matter what. They were the only ones he would accept as his leaders. He had acknowledged that they were his gods. A smirk crossed his lips as he paused. The gods of a god. Pick up the pace, Nagato. Stop daydreaming about the kitsune. Conan shouted, hitting him over the head with a paper fan. A sigh escaped his lips as his eye twitched. Why does she constantly assume it's Naruto I'm thinking about, he wondered. Pushing her loose hair, minus bangs, behind her ear, Kagami frowned lightly as she looked around the store. This is horrible, Tazuna-san, she muttered. Wave used to be so much more, she said with a look of distaste on her face. A small smile crossed his lips before fading. So you and the super brat have been here before, yay? He asked, as he paid for his groceries. Kagami sighed, her arms dropping from the crossed position she found them in most often. As you can guess, I didn't always used to be in Kahona. I traveled for a long time, she muttered. Tazuna looked back at her with blank blinking eyes. Just how old are you? He asked. Her head tilted in his direction, though the headband she stole from her sensei still covered her eyes. 14. I'll be turning 15 in a matter of months, she muttered, shoulders slumping slightly. Tazuna's eyes widened before he started laughing. Man, you take the term super brat to a whole new level, nay? He asked with a chuckle. Yay, laugh it up. I'm a bit taller than Sasuke yet I still look 12, at least I won't have to worry about premature wrinkles or anything. She muttered. Does anyone else on your team know your age? He asked with a tilt of his head. That gray-haired bastard probably knows. And Naru-chan. The other two have never bothered to ask my age. I'm not keeping it a secret. I just won't say anything unless asked, she said with a small shrug. Why are you the one always with me? He asked, confusion in his tone. I'm the only one up to level. Sakura, well, to be truthfully, she's pathetic and she knows it. She's training for that reason. Sasuke, while stronger, is easily angered and has ego problems. Hitaki needs to remind him just how weak and young he really is. Naruto is working on some family skills. Mainly he's finally learning to use a sword. I might not act it, but I am a sword user. It's one of my main abilities, I just don't have to use it often. she said with a careless shrug. Tazuna watched the girl and shrugged. Whatever the reason, I must admit I'm grateful. Naruto's nice and all, but I'd rather be stuck with you than the other super brats. Although it is a bit odd your hatred of the pink girl. You do look like a black-haired version now, he said with a snicker. Kagami rolled her eyes, huffing slightly. She's obsessed with her hair. I cut mine to make an impression. And at this length a braid wouldn't really matter. I used it as a weapon, it's the reason I grew it out in the first place. Kagami muttered, running her hand through the back-length strands. Tazuna blinked in shock. I didn't know hair could be used as a weapon, he said in confusion. Kagami nodded. Anything can be used. I am a master at that. You see, I was taught that anything and everything can be used or turned into a weapon. You just need the skill to do so, she muttered. Tazuna frowned as he watched the blind girl, though he knew she could see perfectly. Just how strong are you? He asked. Kagami paused for a moment and thought. Let's just say that if I really wanted to, I could make sure Hitaki was never a ninja again, and leave it at that, she stated simply. A few moments paused as they walked. Tazuna shocked that this kid was as strong as her sensei, and Kagami thinking over what she had said. Why can't I hate him? She wondered. Shaking her head she sighed. Thanks for teaching me, she said, glancing in his direction. Tazuna laughed in pride. Not many females want to learn my trade. It's an honor to teach someone interested, he said with a grin. Kagami nodded, a small smile crossing her lips. Yes, well, I plan to make a place for my family one day. I just have to figure out where, she said in a wistful tone. A few incidents happened, a man reaching for her bag to get her wallet. His wrist was snapped, and a few coins handed over. The second was a kid tugging on her kimono. She handed over some coins, a few pieces of candy, and her lunch. The kid ran off with wide eyes, calling thanks over her shoulder. Tazuna watched with an odd smile on his face. Have a soft spot for kids, do you? He asked. Hell no, she declared with a scowl, which softened a moment later. I have a soft spot for the suffering, mistreated, and damned. Put me near a happy kid, I'll run away. And if I come across a spoiled brat, well, I end up scaring them for life, she said with a shrug. Tazuna blinked, then chuckled lightly. You shinobi sure or something, he muttered as they headed home. Naruto smiled slightly as he sat on the pier. Kagami had snuck off to speak with Zabuza about tomorrow. Kakashi was reading his book. Sasuke had finally passed out. And Sakura, he felt badly for her. If Kagami wasn't such a sadist, she would leave the poor girl to heal. Instead, she made sure to leave bad injuries so she could heal them afterward and start it again the next day. He wondered how Kagami would react to seeing Gaara again. If there was anyone that would affect Kagami worse than Kakashi and Madara, it was Gaara. He had a feeling he would have to stop her from jumping him. Now that Naruto wouldn't be scared or affected, he could admit Gaara was adorable. In that, I'm a psychopath that needs to be cuddled and loved, sort of way. If he didn't know Kagami had always cared for Kakashi, he would think those two were perfect for each other. He supposed her bond with Gaara transcended even the one she had with Kakashi. They loved each other, but weren't in love. They were closer than siblings, but would never be lovers. He wondered if Kagami would try and get close to him during the exams. He knew for a fact all demons respected Kagami to a level. So Shukaku wouldn't demand her blood. Too afraid she would suck out his soul and shove it in a plush toy or worse. Although Kyuubi would never admit to him what the other option was. You don't want to know, Kit, the voice said with a twitch. Is it really that bad? Kagami wouldn't let me in the mindscape while she visited you. Naruto thought, smiling slightly, glad that he had Q back. They had become close toward the end. And luckily demons could absorb their future selves. They were thinking on having Q shock shoot to his future memories. Just trust me, Kit, it was bad. It's the reason you will never let that she-devil near me again, understood? He demanded. Naruto chuckled slightly. If she wants to talk to you, I can't stop her. She's Athena, she's the judge. I'm just the warhound, he thought in amusement. Her authority overrides mine when it comes to souls, especially souls trapped in other objects or people. He thought in amusement. Sometimes I curse your meeting her. Kyuubi thought with a dropping head. Naruto shrugged his gaze, turning up to the moon. Frowning lightly, he watched the beams that fell past the clouds landing on the water below. What are you going to do about your mates? Kyuubi asked as he rested his head on his paws, closing his eyes. Naruto frowned lightly. How can you be so sure? I mean, that Itachi and Nagato. A loud snort almost made him jump. Trust me kid, I know they're your mates. I've told you, your aura has 3 different slots. That means 3 mates. I know Nagato and Itachi are 2. Nagato because I could feel it when we fought him, and Itachi. It's obvious. I think he might even have a suspicion about it. You two have always felt too comfortable around each other, no matter the situation. Kyuubi snorted in amusement. Naruto blushed slightly, sucking his head. What about the third? He wondered. Kyuubi paused, grinning slightly. It's just not time for that kid. You'll learn eventually? He muttered. Another snort was heard. Now stop thinking and let me rest. My mind's still worn out. He thought. Naruto nodded and the connection was removed. Sighing, he gazed once more at the moon and smiled slightly. Well, Ida-kun, what are you up to? He wondered. It was only Tezuna's trust in the girl that kept him from shouting. Finding his workers all on the ground looking dead had not been pleasant. Kagami's hand had stayed on his arm though, and that kept him calm. Kakashi and Naruto also hadn't reacted much, although Sasuke was tense and Sakura had gasped, looking around with wide eyes. Zabuza stood there with his sword over his shoulder and Haku stood at his side. Naruto ran his hands over the swords he had nicked from the would-be assassins. They had stayed at the house longer this time, getting rid of them, but not before allowing Inari to try and save his mom. After all, the village did still need its will back. Sasuke and Sakura had been sent out to gather the kunai from last night's training. That had taken almost 2 hours to complete between them. By the time they had arrived, the assassins had been dealt with. Kagami had been in the middle of finding out where Gatu's hideout was. While she knew where Zabuza had stayed, she wasn't sure that was where the man had stayed. Needless to say, Sasuke was only more interested in her now. Luckily, it was still in a power-based way. And Sakura had finally realized what a child she truly was. Naruto's gaze drifted toward the masked boy and a smile spread across his lips. A small shift of his fingers in a wave told Naruto Haku realized that Naruto recognized him. Zabuza huffed lightly, walking toward them. Sakura and Sasuke tensed but stood still when Kakashi held his arm out. Zabuza stopped a small distance away. Looking the group over, he snorted slightly. You can call your brats off. There's no need for us to fight, he said as he stabbed his sword into the bridge. Kakashi blinked slowly. Oh? He asked lazily. Hi, we found out that Gauto is planning to set us up. He has betrayed us and will not be giving us our payment, Haku said in a formal tone. Zabuza nodded in a jerky, almost twitchy manner. Yay, and that's the only reason I took this pathetic job, if I ain't getting paid. There is no need for me to listen or complete my contract. I just have to make the traitor walks into this trap, he said with a shrug. Kakashi blinked and nodded slowly. I see, he muttered. A moment paused and he was once again buried nose first into his book. Zabuza made a noise of annoyance as he released the mist jutsu. Kagami stepped away from Tezuna and stepped forward to meet the two. A grin crossed Zabuza's face, visible without the bandages. Quite a bunch of brats you've joined Kana, Zabuza mumbled with a sarcastic tone. Kagami's head turned as if she was glancing at them as well. Meh, they'll grow up. We are hoping that this little adventure might make their first experience. It all depends on how many will be scared off the backup, she muttered with a tilt of her head. The grin grew and he jerked his head toward the boy. I had hoped the same, but I'm sure it will be for the best that he remains pure, at least a bit longer, Zabuza said with a rough growl at the end. Kagami's lips twitched. She knew the man thought of Haku as his son. He didn't act on those feelings in fear of the boy dying or he himself. However, now that Kagami had given him permanent employment, he had decided to do better. And that meant keeping those that would taint Haku away. Not that he would be any gentler or kinder. In fact, he would probably be crueler. At least this way he wouldn't be worried about anyone seeing the care he felt for the boy. Naruto stepped forward, stopping at Haku and handing over one of the swords. This way we match, he said with a cute grin. Haku smiled behind his mask and bowed his head. Thank you, Naru, he said, taking the sword. Maybe next time we meet we can have a match? He asked. Naruto grinned and nodded swiftly. You bet. I'm sure the sadists won't rest until we're good enough for a spar, he said with a chuckle that Haku returned. They both winced when their mentors smacked them in the back of the head. Sakura and Sasuke however were watching the scene in shock and interest. "Hey, Sakura?" Sasuke muttered. "Yes, Sasuke-kun?" she replied with a frown. "Doesn't this seem, somehow rehearsed to you?" he asked with a slight twitch. "I was thinking the same thing," she answered with a deadpanned expression. Both turned to look at Kakashi. He looked up catching their stares and eyes smiled. Something's not right about this, they thought. Shaking their heads they looked up and blinked in shock. "Where's Kagami?" A bloodbath. Kagami stood there with her head tilted as she watched the happenings. She had finally returned to the bridge, and what a glorious sight to return to. She took a moment to close her eyes and allowed the scent of blood to fill her. It reminded her of those cursed days following that man, but she could never deny that she had enjoyed killing for him. It had always been a part of her and always would be. Which was strange since she didn't enjoy violence. Perhaps it was violence itself she disliked, but death she enjoyed? Opening her eyes again she took in the scene with a small smile. Zabuza was chasing the foolish man around with his cleaver, a manic laugh echoing around. He seemed to be enjoying himself. And she could almost see Kisame running with him. Those two were so alike, she feared they might be related. It caused her to wonder if it was the mother of father that was so shark-like. Haku and Naruto stood side by side trying out new stances with their blades to cut down anyone that came close. Haku was already messing around with his bloodline, putting a coat of ice around the blade. While Naruto was trying to remember how to use Kyuubi's chakra without gaining attention. In the end he settled for wind manipulation. It would still be a while before he could gain the control he had before. A few of the more foolish mercenaries had rushed toward Tazuna. While Sasuke was prepared, the first to get to them was Sakura. Results of Kagami's training already showing after only a week. Her speed was up to where Sasuke's had been before he learned tree walking. And the punch she packed almost reminded Kagami of the few times she had seen her strength in the future. While Sakura didn't kill anyone, her hands were touched by blood. Sasuke seemed to be taking a more defensive route, thankfully. Though that was probably more to Kakashi telling him that without defense you would die the moment your offense was broken. Sasuke had been training to be back up, or long distance. It helped with his fire jutsu speed anyway, so he wasn't complaining. Quite a few charred bodies littered the area, even if they weren't dead. And truthfully that was probably the only reason Sasuke wasn't annoyed. Living and suffering through those attacks was worse than death. Kagami sighed, closing her eyes. The wind blowing blood-soaked hair from her back and trailing droplets along the ground. Her skin and clothing were stained and dripping with it, as she stood watching the carnage before her. She had returned a few moments ago, to make sure no one got around Haruno and the Uchiha. However, her gaze kept drifting to one person particular. A blush rose lightly to her cheeks as her eyes lowered slightly. Kakashi was a vicious splash of blood and lightning. Around him bodies piled, just as they trailed behind Zabuza. He moved like one would think of dancing, but there was no grace or elegance to it, like when Kagami fought. No, his was all rough jerks, brute strength, and swift strikes. He was serious glares and remorseless actions. Almost cruel malice shined from his eyes. Kagami had never been one for beautiful things anyway. They broke too easily. She loved watching beautiful things, though. Loved watching them fall and crumble. All she saw a beautiful thing was worth, was mere appearance. Something to look at and enjoy, but also something to never get attached to. Something worth gazing at, but never owning. And Kakashi was addicting to her in a way beautiful could never be. It slowly all drifted to a stop. The last few smart enough tried to run, only to be trapped by Haku's mirror and cut through by Kakashi and Zabuza. Normally Kakashi would never fight like this. And never in front of rookie Genin. However, Kakashi was no longer normal. Far older in mind than his body. He needed this. The last thing he remembered, the last thing he had come from, was a world filled with death, killing, survival, and savage rage. To be ripped from that world, where everything had been destroyed and taken. Where you had to fight, and scratch, and claw just to stay alive. To be brought to the past where there was still life and hope. It was disgusting, and painful. Kakashi had long given into the cruelty and malice. The very same thing he had blamed Kagami for helping Naruto give in to. However, there had been no other way to survive. And his mind was calling for it. It craved it, it was the only thing he had known those last few years. What he had gotten used to, accepted. What he had needed to keep from snapping like so many other had. Sakura, Ino, Shikamaru, Tamari, Guy, Lee, Ten, Konohamaru, Kurenai, Hanabi, and Kiba all snapping under the strain. Only Shikamaru keeping enough of a mental state to be of use and not a thoughtless killing machine. And Kurenai's baby kept her from giving in, kept her sane after she had already snapped form, almost losing everyone. Even though he knew that world was gone, and he would be damned if he made sure it never came to be. He still couldn't help but slip back to that time. Back when your allies were nothing more than fodder, and your enemies needed to be destroyed enough to not be reanimated. He only kept enough of his mind to make sure they went down. In that world, you had gone back and made sure the kill was done. Made sure it couldn't be reanimated. Now he just made sure they went down. Dead or alive didn't matter. He just wanted them down and blood all around. He could honestly understand why Kagami hated him so much in the past. He knew why he had to change. Knew why he had to make sure she didn't get away again. Had to make sure she was his this time. Not Itachi's, not Sai's, not Shikamaru's, not Gaara's, and never Madara's, but his. And he would, even if he had to carve his name into her this time. A part of him hated his past self. His passive, almost pacifist self. The him that had hated and blamed Kagami. The him that had been angry at Naruto. The him that had watched Konoha burn, along with every other village. The him that had damaged the bond with Naruto so much, that he never understood why the boy didn't hate him. The him that had left Sakura to be taken in by Tsunade, and ultimately destroyed herself. The him that had blamed everyone but himself. He would never forgive the past Kakashi. And the reminder that neither would Kagami forget or forgive the past him, kept him from trying to defend himself. It kept him from pushing her too hard. From demanding an answer to his feelings. He knew how much his past self had screwed up. And he knew how much he would have to work to fix things. To keep that world from appearing again. It was silent. While everyone had cheered earlier and celebrated, it was silent now. Tsunami had taken Inari to his father's grave for the first time. The boy had said he was finally ready to stop running from him. Tsunami had tears in her eyes as she had agreed to take him. They were both emotionally drained when they got back. Immediately going to bed after dinner. Tazuna sat with jugs of sake piled around him. His gaze sober and staring out the window at the moon. He was relieved and happy Wave would finally be moving on. He closed his eyes as flashes of the bloodshed passed behind closed eyelids. He had finally realized the life of a shinobi was nothing to joke about. Even if they were kids. Seeing the pink girl almost decapitate a man had jerked him from any pity and remorse he had at tricking the team here. Things like that were their job. Sighing, he brought the jug to his mouth again. He only hoped he could be as strong as they were and bring peace back to Wave. Zabuza had crashed long ago not far from the man. Legs and arms sprawled out and a pink tint to his face from being intoxicated. Haku had merely shaken his head and moved to leave with Naruto to go to the pier. There had been a faint smile on the boy's lips though. And Zabuza had proven to be an interesting idealistic person when not trying to cut you into pieces. Sasuke and Sakura had finally entered a small state of shock at seeing so much death. Not too affecting really. What with Sasuke seeing the Uchiha massacre, and the genjutsus Kagami forced on Sakura. However, they had eventually gone silent towards the night. Sakura retreating to her room to think over things. Sasuke had wandered to the place that had trained. Naruto had left with Haku. Both had spent the night talking. Naruto telling Haku everything. About the future, about what had originally happened. Kagami had agreed it wouldn't be worth giving Haku his memories. He hadn't seen what they had. However, he and Zabuza would become gods. So he was telling the boy everything. Kagami had said she would still help him build a tolerance to her eyes, but she didn't need to merge his past and future self. And Kagami, she was currently sitting on the roof with one Hitaki Kakashi. Stop that, she said, reaching out and smacking the back of his head. Kakashi's glare snapped to her. It softened a moment later before he turned away again. But why? We could stop everything? All we need to do is kill them. Get rid of the ones that caused everything. Save everyone that died. Why won't you agree? He hissed, hunching over. Kagami's eyes rested on him as she held Naruto's headband on her lap. Sighing, she turned her eyes back to the moon. Actions cause consequences, she mumbled. holding up a hand when Kakashi turned to speak. "We can't save everyone. I can't take you further to the past and save Obito, Rin, and Minato," she said with a glare. Kakashi jerked back with a blink. He hadn't even thought about that. Actually he had. Every day. What he could have done differently. How he could have saved them. But he had never even thought about forcing her to do that. He didn't know why she was bringing it up. She turned to him with a slight glare. "Don't you understand? If Obito had never died, you never would have changed. You would have still believed that those that broke the rules were trash. Even if it was for a comrade. You never would have gained his eye. Hell, Obito would never have awakened his Sharingan. If Minato hadn't died, Konoha would have been destroyed. Or it's possible the seal wouldn't have worked, or Shinigami wouldn't have agreed. If Rin had stayed alive, you would have never left Anbu. Never stop trying to kill yourself for redemption. Do you understand?" She hissed in annoyance and anger. Kakashi blinked at her, his mind filled with memories. He never would be the person he was, if those things hadn't happened. Sighing, she turned away again. If I had saved my mother," she whispered lowly. Kakashi's head jerked up to stare at her with serious eyes. He had wondered if she had lived this time. It would appear she hadn't. "I would have never had reason to destroy that corrupt village. If I had saved my mother and destroyed it, she would have never forgiven me. My clan, the Kiyoshimana clan, has always been about peace and balance. I can only do something with justifiable cause. Doing something merely to stop or change another. Killing someone because of what they would or could do, and not what they had or did do. That's no better than Madara," she said with a frown. Kakashi turned with blank eyes. "No better than him?" he questioned. "If we go around killing people that had never even done anything to us, there would be consequences. If we killed Danzo before the right time, before he made his move, we would either be executed, or deemed traitors. Nei would come after us and no one in Konoha would trust us. Because there would be no proof, no reason. We can say what he would have done, but we would have been thought as crazy, as Danzo had never done it yet. Actions always have consequences. We must wait for those actions before reacting. We can work around them. Try and make them never happen. But we cannot judge or punish those that had not made the actions yet. Otherwise we are nothing more than cold-blooded murderers, claiming truth and justice. And as Athena, I cannot allow that to happen," she said, staring at the moon. Kakashi turned to watch her for a few moments, before following her gaze. The Sandaime had to die for Tsunade to come back, so the only way to keep him alive would be. Kagami nodded. If Tsunade had already returned and accepted, then we could work around that, and maybe make sure he lived. She muttered, closing her eyes. "Hitaki, we have a chance. Don't throw it away over revenge and the need to act. We will make sure that world never appears, but we have to be careful. Even now, my power is constantly activated, keeping Madara from merging his future soul to his past. If he ever slips through, that will be the only time I will say to hell with the plan. For now, all we can do is wait," she said, opening her eyes to glare at the moon. Kakashi nodded slowly with a sigh. "I understand," he said dully. And he did. He had allowed his future mind to overrun his thoughts. He had allowed his memories and instincts to take control and cloud his vision. So much death, so much pain. He was tired of it. But now he realized he wasn't alone. Naruto, Aiko, Kagami, Pain, even Itachi. They had all gone through the same thing. The need, the want to fix things. To make sure it never happened, ignoring what was right and wrong. The need for vengeance on all that had happened. They couldn't let that happen. They couldn't let their selfishness destroy the chance at peace they had. Now, he knew why none of the others had acted. They all had to play along. He just wished it could end sooner. A chuckle escaped him. He remembered always telling the brats to be patient. It seemed their impatience had worn off on him. Or was it their need to protect and follow their dreams? Haku pulled Naruto close, holding him in a tight hug. "You take care of yourself," he muttered before pulling away with a smile. It was the next day and the pair had decided to get to aim. Zabuza wanted to mess with Kisame again, and Haku wanted to meet Aiko and Kimimaro. Zabuza was taking the scroll Kagami handed him with a nod. Tsunami, Inari, and Tazuna had also joined to see their house guests off. Tsunami handing over a copy of her meals to Haku, while Tazuna tossed Zabuza a jug of wave sake. Kakashi, Sakura, and Sasuke stood in the background. Kakashi's nose perched in his book. Sasuke with a thoughtful expression on his face as he watched the four saying their farewells. Sakura had a determined expression on her face. Her hands would clench every now and then. Naruto gave one last head pat and grinned. Haku gave a bow to Kagami before turning with Zabuza and leaving through the early morning mist. The group stood around watching for a few moments longer before they all split up. Kakashi taking Sasuke and Sakura. Tsunami and Inari heading back to the house with Naruto. And Kagami heading to the construction site with Tazuna. Naruto panted lightly as he finished yet another slash at the tree. Moving backward, he stared at the thin shallow cut in the trunk. Sighing, Naruto turned his attention to the sword in his hand. The flimsy almost there chakra barely even causing it to glow slightly. Sighing, he dropped the blade and fell back. Maybe it's too soon for wind manipulation. All I can do is make the blade itself shaper. And I didn't start learning it until I was 15 anyway. He thought, closing his eyes. Sometimes it annoyed him, really truly annoyed him. This body was so young and short. While it was stronger, faster, more advanced than it had been the first time around. Times like this he missed his grown-up body. Naruto's eyes snapped open and he grinned. Closing his eyes, he concentrated on his mindscape. The place where he was still in his older form, although it had stopped aging luckily. He didn't want to see himself as an old man, thank you. Reaching up and making a seal, he locked his mind on the image. Henge, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He called out with a grin. A second later he opened his eyes and his grin widened. He was surrounded by versions of his future self. Looking down, he clenched his fist, happy to feel the calluses he remembered. Jumping up, he smirked, throwing his cloak off. So wind manipulation will have to wait. The rest of my training won't. And maybe I can try senjutsu as well. Well, maybe I can at least concentrate enough to feel it. He thought, grabbing his sword once more. Giving a few swings, he was glad that even though it was a henge, this body remembered using a sword. Grinning and shaking his head, he turned to his copies. Kagami watched form over Tazuna's shoulder as he looked over his blueprints. He was explaining to her that every single thing that was needed. How each individual bolt and nut was important. She was getting a hold of things rather swiftly. When he wasn't showing and explaining things to her, she was working with the other men. Learning the correct way to mold and move things. To her it was all extremely interesting. Dinner was calm, almost happy. Kakashi was back to his book. Naruto was eating as much as he could. Although Kagami's glare kept him from stuffing himself until he spewed. Sasuke had also gotten into another race with the blonde, but even he had slowed down when Kagami started twitching. He might not be able to see her glare, but he had learned the feel of it. Tsunami was happier, it was easy to see from her expression. She talked calmly and without the hint of depression and sarcasm she held before. Inari was also happy. He talked with a smile on his face. He had also taken to calling the team Ni-san and Ne-chan. Even Sakura had accepted it, ruffling the kid's hair. Kakashi was happy to see how well those two were doing. Kakashi couldn't quite remember how they had originally acted to their first kills. Sasuke's had been his opponent in the Chunin exams, but he had been too worn out from the seal to react. And he couldn't remember ever seeing Sakura's. He had a feeling hers had been before Naruto arrived, probably at her own Chunin exam. He couldn't really compare the times. When it came around time to head to bed, it was a quiet affair. Naruto actually managing to pass out. It reminded Kakashi of the first time they had been in Wave. Sasuke had also crashed not long after he reached his futon. Kakashi merely shook his head and made himself comfortable in his normal corner. They would be leaving back for Konoha soon. He would allow his team to do as they pleased until then. Although he would continue to train Sakura in stamina, and Sasuke in being a support fighter. Even if he did go to Orochimaru, he had decided to train them all equally this time. No mess-ups. Kagami would be training her own students, not to mention she would be gaining her own teacher. And she would be getting her probational missions. So he would have from now till the exams to train them. And even after that he knew he would still be training them. Should they pass or not? Kagami tilted her head in thoughts as she sat on her futon. Her kimono had already been removed, along with her pants. She sat cross-legged in her crimson bodysuit. Her arm gloves had been removed, revealing the fishnet pair she wore underneath that were fingerless and reached above her elbows. Same for the spandex leg warmers that covered from her calves to her feet, except her toes and heel. Her eyes were covered with her original cloth and her hair pulled back into a mid-back tail. Sakura stood before her futon, her fists clenching every now and then. Kagami knew she wanted to talk to her, but she would allow the girl to start the conversation. And if she couldn't but find the nerve, then Kagami wouldn't have to worry about it now, would she? A few moments passed and Kagami finally shrugged, turning in for the night. She lay down, turning over and pulled her blankets up. Kagami? Sakura muttered quietly as she also crawled into her futon. Kagami paused for a moment. Yes, Haruno? She asked. I want to learn. I'm tired of holding everyone back. I don't want to be a liability. Even though Sasuke-kun protected me on the bridge, that's not what I want anymore. I want to be able to take care of myself. To be able to protect them if needed. So, please? Kagami frowned lightly. The girl almost sounded close to tears. Although Kagami couldn't find herself scolding her this time. Instead of crying for some useless reason, she was crying because of how weak and worthless she found herself. And while Kagami still found that annoying and useless, it proved the girl was getting better. Sighing, she closed her eyes. We'll start tomorrow. Pain couldn't help but clench his fist, snapping another pen. He was hunched over with a dark cloud over his head. The sound of noise that seemed to grow every minute in the building had him contemplating mass slaughter. He was getting sick of this. A part of him wished the members of Akatsuki weren't so skilled. Then maybe it would take them longer to return. It had been little over a week since Zabuza had joined them. And already he could feel his sanity slipping. The combination of Zabuza and Kisami's fights, Deidara's explosions and temper, Deidara and Sasori's fights, Hidan's cursing, Kakuzu's money-hogging, Zetsu's questionable loyalty, Konan's sudden violent dominatrix personality, Itachi's Pocky obsession. It was driving him crazy. If it wasn't for Haku, Aiko, and Kimimaro, he would have run screaming long ago. However, he couldn't do that. He was the god of aim. It wouldn't be good for a god to be seen running away and screaming like a little girl. Since his arrival, Zabuza had challenged Kisame to a fight every day, or vice versa. He and Hidan had bumped heads and had arguments that lasted days at a time. Had both pissed Deidara off and helped him torment the other members. Had also pissed Sasori off by calling him creepy. Had adopted Kimimaro and was trying to corrupt the boy with alcohol. And had stolen Itachi's Pocky. Pain shivered remembering that. Itachi had been on a rampage. It had not been pretty at all. He had shoved Deidara's explosion down his coat before it went off. Destroyed quite a few of Sasori's puppets. Had stolen Kakuzu's case to go buy more. Had attacked Hidan with his own scythe, cutting off his head and leaving him to yell and rant in Pain's office. Had used Tsukuyomi on Konan. Tried to set Zetsu on fire. And finally had almost decapitated Zabuza when he found the Pocky. After that he was too happy to do any more damage. Needless to say, they all knew not to touch the treat on fear of an angry Uchiha. The only ones that escaped his wrath being Kimimaro, Haku, and Aiko. Then again, they were the ones he got along with the most, other than Pain himself. Anyway, the point was, Pain needed to get them all out. Now, or he swore he would kill them all himself. Now if only he could find a long enough mission. His eyes landed on the scroll Zabuza had brought from Kagami. Oh, yes? He thought, a smirk crossing his face. He would have to thank Athena. Of course she would give him something to do. Kagami finished packing everything back in her backpack. Her eyebrow twitched when those eyes continued to stare at her even now. Her fist clenched and a slight growl escaped her throat. People are going to think you're a perverted old man if you keep this up. Kagami huffed as she finally turned her glare onto the annoyance. Kakashi shrugged, reaching up and scratching the back of his head. Meh, meh. It wouldn't be so bad if you looked the age you should be. Not to mention how old you really are. If I'm guessing right, you're about, 26 years old? That's the same age as me, although I suppose I'm 29 now. This is rather confusing. Kakashi trailed off with a small frown. Kagami snorted. You're telling me, you've just merged with yourself so you can claim to be either 26 or 29. We on the other hand have been merged for 7 years. It's a bit harder to say we're younger. Kagami said as she paused, sitting on her knees. She snorted, shaking her head. Still, there's an 11-year difference. Not much, and I've heard of larger differences. But most people think I'm 13. That would make you both a perverted old man and pedophile. Kakashi I smiled. But you're 26 and I'm 29 mentally, so there's only a 3-year difference," he said with a happily chirp. A moment later he fell from the window when the brick Kagami threw at him connected with his head. Kagami leaned out watching him rub his head in pain. "I told you I'm not talking about that sort of stuff with you. Get over it, Hitaki," she hissed, slamming the window shut. Kakashi winced as he sat up slowly looking at the slightly cracked window shutters. He continued to rub his head with a slight frown. A moment later a small smile crossed his face as he chuckled lowly. "You can't keep running from me, Kana Kagami," he muttered lowly with a soft spark in his eyes. Suddenly the spark turned cruel and harsh. "Even if I have to force you down and carve my affections into you," he finished with a smirk as he stood brushing himself off. Naruto glanced to his left. Kagami stood with her mask back in place and her fingers twitching. Naruto knew that meant she was a few inches away from snapping. She usually started twitching before she started judging people in the past. As normal she ignored everyone, especially their sensei. A few seconds later she would glare and snarl at Kakashi. And Naruto knew her gaze cruel and filled with rage, although there was something fragile beneath it, just as she used to in the past. He had seen it before she hid her expression behind that blank porcelain. His gaze shifted to the right. Kakashi's expression seemed to keep switching. One moment it was the lazy bored man that was his sensei, the next his gaze sharpened, becoming the cruel sadistic man that had been his friend and comrade. The shift happened every few minutes and he was doing well in controlling himself. Even Itachi had come close to smacking Sasuke before the massacre. He would glance at Kagami every few seconds, his gaze becoming possessive and longing mixed with hatred. Again, just as he used to in the past, Naruto couldn't help but sigh silently. It would seem their problems wouldn't fade anytime soon. It annoyed him to be truthful. Perhaps he should have agreed with Tsunade, Shikamaru, and surprisingly Gaara when they had suggested locking them in a closet together. However, just as back then he feared the body count should he try. A shiver raced up in back at the thought. Best to let them work it out on their own. He knew Kagami was about to explode. Sure, she was his sister, but he had never been the closest to her. Not even Aiko had. No, that had been Shikamaru, Sai, Iruka, and Gaara. Those had been Kagami's confidants, her royal court. He knew when the gods were fully awakened, they would be serving under her. As well as Hinata and probably Kakashi. Naruto shook his head and turned his attention to his teammates. Sasuke hadn't changed much in appearance. Naruto knew that Sasuke still hadn't realized that he had awakened his Sharingan. Kakashi had agreed to hold off until they talked to the Sandaime. It had appeared when one of the thugs had gotten a little too close to Sakura on the bridge. His eyes were still dark and anger and vengeance still drifted from him. However, Sasuke no longer saw them as dead weight. He saw that Naruto and Sakura actually had some use to them. Naruto knew he didn't really care about them, like friends, but that he didn't think them useless anymore. It had taken a long time for that to happen before. And even then he had never allowed himself to believe it. Naruto had to wonder at how this alone would change things. Sakura was changing much faster than he had thought. It would seem Kagami's being here was indeed a good thing. The only main difference at the moment was her battle dress. Or what was left of it. The ends had been torn to end her thighs. Long enough to cover her modesty, since her shorts were tight spandex. It reminded Naruto more of the outfit she wore in the future, more than he liked to think of. Her knees and part of her shins covered in bandages that merged with her shorts. Her hands up to above her wrists had also been wrapped. The biggest change was that she now pulled her hair back into a low tail, and sometimes she was even seen wearing it in a braid similar to how Kagami had. It would seem Sakura had finally found an idol. And to think it had only taken her being mental tortured and bodily broken. Naruto had a feeling that when the Chunin exams came they would all be changing their outfits, not just Kagami. And more than they had originally. Sakura Haruno was a complicated child. She knew she wasn't the easiest to get along with. Her inner Sakura made her voice her more violent and dangerous behavior. However, she tried as hard as she could to be kind, sweet, caring, a respectable person. But how could she when she had all this rage and hatred within her? Very few people had seen the true Sakura. To this day only 2 people had an idea to what she hid within her. Her old friend Yamanaka Ino, who knew that she had problems. She didn't exactly go from a shy, scared little girl to happy and outspoken instantly. And her teammate Kana Kagami, who had seen her true self in the genjutsus that had been placed on her. She was afraid of Kagami, yes, but not because of the torture she had been put through in those illusions. It was because Kagami had come face to face with inner Sakura and her true self. Kagami had seen the hatred and rage Sakura hid within her, buried deep down and covered with the memories she held dear and precious. The feelings she tried to pretend didn't exist. She hated her parents. They never understood. She had been teased, bullied, and abused because of her appearance. However, no matter how much she cried and tried to talk to them, they hadn't understood. It reached the point that they simply didn't care. They learned to block out their daughter's whining and complaining, encouraging her to stand up for herself without teaching or showing her how. Ino had been the only one to care. Not only had she asked what was wrong and listened, she had also helped her and told her how foolish she was being. Ino had shown her that she was pretty and cute, and her forehead wasn't large. Ino was her savior, someone she would hold dear forever. However, just because she now had happiness and someone to help didn't make the pain, anger, and hatred go away. Her parents had been happy that she made a new friend. They had been proud that she was no longer hiding herself. But they never tried to help her, never once had they offered advice, simply listened to her problems, taught her how to smile and be proud of whom she was. No, only Ino had done these things. It was why she had joined the Shinobi Academy as soon as she could. She couldn't stand her parents. Their empty presence, their apathetic love. It was almost cruel that they hadn't given much of a fuss. Only mentioning that she could prove herself to be someone now. That had been a low blow. It made her question herself once more. Had she never been a someone in their eyes? They had never been proud of her, had they? No, it was Ino. They had been proud that their daughter had someone else to whine and complain to. That Ino had helped their daughter stop being pathetic and worthless. She had to prove herself just to get their notice, their love? Why was that? Weren't they supposed to be there for her, no matter what? She would though. She would prove herself, and maybe they would be proud for her being her, and maybe they would love her like they should. It wasn't fair, and it made her so angry. Ino had understood, had helped her. She was there for her, held her while she cried and screamed about how unfair it was. Promised to help her learn what she needed to. Promised to help her prove herself to gain her parents' attention. Slowly that anger faded away to determination. It was still there, along with the hatred she felt from being a victim and the betrayal she felt when she realized her parents would never care to try and understand her. She wasn't the only one though. There was a boy she met, named Uchiha Sasuke. When she had first seen him she had thought he was cute. However, that paled when she had seen his eyes. He had the same eyes as her. The eyes of someone that needed to prove themselves, someone who needed to be a somebody. The only difference was that while it was her parents that wanted her to prove herself to be a somebody, Sasuke actually wanted to prove himself on his own. Watching him she realized that it wasn't that at all. No, the boy wanted to prove himself not truly on his own, no, it was for someone else. His older brother, or at least she thought he was. She watched his eyes light up with love and joy, simple and pure happiness when the other was around, and that spark of being important, being noticed, of proving himself was all the brighter. He wanted to prove himself to that boy, just as she wanted to prove herself to her parents. For love, they were the same. It made her so happy. There was someone like her, she wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one that struggled for attention and praise. She decided she liked that boy and she would become close to him. Maybe together they could do it. She hadn't liked Sasuke like all the others did. She just wanted to get close to him, that was all. Ino still helped, but there was turmoil in her friend. One that she refused to share with Sakura and hid from her friend. It hurt to think anything could come between them. However, that changed. Sasuke's family was killed, and when he came back he was different. He wasn't the boy she had wanted to help and be friends with. No, he still wanted to prove himself, but it was different. It was filled with rage and hatred and betrayal. And it was a mirror of the night she realized the truth. Only Sasuke didn't have anyone to help him, no one to comfort him and be there for him. She was more determined to get close to him, to help him much like Ino had helped her. She had happily told her friend her plans. Ino mistook what she meant. And from then on she saw a darkness in her friend's gaze, an annoyance that reminded her too much of when her parents tried to ignore and block her out. It hurt more than anything had. Eventually she broke away, betraying her friend before she would betray her. And then there was that boy, Uzumaki Naruto. A boy just like her, a boy she saw the same hatred and rage within along with the need to prove himself. However, he had no one to prove himself to. He only wanted to prove himself for himself alone. She couldn't believe how selfish he was. He had never had parents that scorned and ridiculed him. He had never had anyone that he craved no needed attention and love from. He had never been betrayed and broken by those closest to him, not like she and Sasuke had. How dare he have eyes like theirs when he hadn't ever suffered the disappointments of those he loved? And to top it all off, he wasn't serious about. While Sasuke trained constantly and she studied all she could, he goofed off and played around. How dare he have their determination to prove himself and abuse and misuse it? How dare he glare out at the world as if he had been betrayed and hurt? He had never had anyone, he didn't even know what love was. And when someone tried to help him, he ignored them, mocked them, and threw it back in their faces by doing whatever he wanted. How dare he act like a victim and not be serious about changing it? She hated him, couldn't stand him. How dare he have those eyes and not be serious about it? But suddenly, everything changed. One day, Naruto was different. The need to prove himself was gone, as was the hatred and rage. And she was happy and she could forgive him. He continued to mock everyone, including Sasuke. But he no longer held the eyes she and Sasuke did. He no longer acted like a victim that refused to help himself. And she could forgive him because he had realized how foolish he was. He was more serious in his determination, which also made the hatred she felt fade. However, she couldn't bring herself to forget it, couldn't erase the rage and hatred she had added to her growing amount. So she buried it, and inner Sakura kept it under control. Inner Sakura made sure that the anger and hatred that consumed her were controlled and hidden. After all, she needed to prove herself, and anger and hatred would only destroy her. It was something she wanted to help Sasuke with. And then she came, Kagami. And Sakura wasn't sure what to feel anymore. Naruto suddenly had someone who loved him, and he didn't do anything to gain that love. And he loved her in return, effortlessly. It wasn't fair. And Kagami's eyes were always covered, but she was empty. Always so empty, and blank, and mature, and uncaring, and yet she loved Naruto unconditionally. She was jealous, and because of that she couldn't stop it, couldn't stop the hatred and anger from rising once more. From consuming and poisoning her mind against her teammates. And Kagami had found it. Kagami had come face to face with it and hadn't cared. She hadn't flinched from the feelings Sakura was sure would destroy her should she let them free. She had merely accepted them and then broken her mind. But she fixed it too. Slowly, softly, caringly, she had placed Sakura's mind back together and then moved on. And suddenly Sakura knew. She knew why Naruto no longer needed to prove himself. He had accepted and been accepted for what he was, for what he felt. And Sakura had been accepted too. Kagami hadn't thought it wrong, she hadn't mocked or judged her. She hadn't ignored her either, she hadn't just moved on and forgotten about her. No, Kagami had helped her, had fixed her, and now all she had to do was accept herself. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone anymore. Because it didn't matter. All she had ever needed to do was prove herself, to herself. She had needed to accept it. She needed to accept the betrayal, the pain, the hatred, the anger. All this time she had refused to be a victim again, and that was all she had been. She had never truly freed herself like she thought. All she had done was hiding away and accept denial of herself. She had continued to be bound down to what happened, to her childhood and her parents. So what if her parents never showed her love and attention? She had already received it and so foolishly thrown it away. She had what she had always wanted. All she had to do was hope Ino would forgive her for being a coward.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.